I reached the cabin late in the afternoon, after a long drive through empty roads and thick forest that seemed to grow denser the deeper I went. The plan was simple. I wanted 3 quiet days away from noise, people, work, and everything else that had been building up in my mind for months. The cabin was small, old, and isolated, sitting alone on a narrow slope above a dried-up lake bed. I had rented it because it was cheap and because the pictures made it seem peaceful. I liked the idea of being surrounded by nothing but trees, wind, and the sound of my own footsteps. When I first stepped out of the car, the air felt colder than I expected. The place looked abandoned, with long grass brushing against the wooden steps and the windows covered in a thin layer of dirt. I walked slowly around the cabin, letting the silence settle in. The only noise came from the tall trees rubbing together whenever the wind pushed through them. It felt like the forest was alive and breathing in a slow, heavy way. I carried my bags inside. The door creaked louder than it should have. The inside looked almost the same as the photos, but much darker. The furniture was old, the wooden floor had deep scratches, and the air had a stale smell, like the place had been closed for months. The cabins I had stayed in before always felt warm, or at least lived in. This one felt untouched, like nobody had stepped inside for a long time. I placed my backpack on the couch and looked around. One small kitchen, one bedroom, a tiny bathroom, and a living room with a wide window that overlooked the empty lake bed. The window was the only thing that looked clean, almost too clean, like someone had wiped it recently. I didn't think much of it. I unpacked my things slowly, trying to adjust my mind to the quiet. By the time I finished, the sun was already dropping behind the trees. The light inside the cabin became orange and soft. I stepped outside again, wanting to take in the area before it got dark. The place felt peaceful at first. The forest stretched out all around me and the ground sloped down toward the dried lake bed, which looked like a huge bowl of cracked earth. I walked around the yard, noticing random things like an old fire pit filled with wet ash, a broken wooden chair lying on its side, and a thin wire fence at the edge of the tree line. The fence looked useless, bent in several places. When I looked at the tree line for longer than a few seconds, something about it bothered me. It looked too dense, almost unnatural, like all the trees were packed tightly together on purpose. I brushed it off and went back inside, closing the door behind me. The lock felt weak when I turned it. That first night, I settled on the couch with a blanket and scrolled through my phone. The reception was weak, but I didn't care. I wanted time away from everything anyway. I turned off the lights and let the cabin grow dark around me. The only light came from my phone screen, which lit up my hands and the fabric of the couch. After some time, I put the phone aside and closed my eyes. That was when I heard the first noise. It was faint, too faint to be anything dangerous. I thought it was just the wood settling or a branch brushing against the wall outside. But as I lay still, listening, I realized it wasn't the cabin. It sounded like footsteps outside, slow and careful, moving along the side of the house toward the back. I opened my eyes and waited. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed stretched out so long that I started to question whether I had even heard anything at all. I stayed awake for almost an hour before exhaustion took over. When I woke up the next morning, everything felt normal again. The sunlight came through the window and warmed the wooden floor. I made breakfast and ate near the window, watching the empty lake bed. The silence felt peaceful again. The noise from the night seemed like something my tired mind invented. After breakfast, I decided to explore the forest. I followed a thin path behind the cabin that led deeper into the trees. The further I walked, the dimmer the light became. The trees were tall, thick, and old. Their trunks were dark and covered in rough bark that broke off in small flakes. The path continued for a long time, winding between trees and rocks. I noticed things that made me slow down. Broken branches that looked freshly snapped, footprints I couldn't identify in the dirt, and torn pieces of fabric stuck on a bush. I told myself that hikers or hunters may have passed through recently. The explanation felt weak, but it helped push away the uneasiness in my stomach. I walked until I could barely see my cabin through the trees. The air felt colder there, almost heavy. The silence was different, not peaceful but tense, like something was waiting behind the trunks. I turned around and walked back, trying not to look behind me. The ground felt uneven beneath my steps, and the hairs on the back of my neck kept rising. When I reached the cabin again, I felt safer. The cabin might have been old and weak, but at least it had walls. I went inside, locked the door, and tried to shake the feeling off. I made lunch and forced myself to relax, but part of my attention kept drifting to the windows. As the day passed, I noticed small things. The window facing the lake had smudges on it, long streaks like something had been brushing against the outside glass. I pressed my fingers against them, comparing the size. The marks were longer than my hand. Maybe someone had wiped dirt away, or maybe it was just rainwater that dried in odd patterns. But the sky had been clear for days. Later in the afternoon, I walked down to the dried lake bed. The ground cracked beneath my shoes with every step. I crouched down and ran my fingers across the cracks. They were sharp and dry. The place looked dead. As I stood there, I looked back at the cabin. It stood alone above the hill, its windows dark and still. For a moment, it looked like someone was standing behind the front window, but when I blinked, the shape was gone. Probably just the angle or my own shadow playing tricks. The second night was colder. I wrapped myself in a thicker blanket and sat near the window again. The lake bed looked completely black outside. The trees surrounding it were just tall shapes pressed together. I stared at them for a long time until the shape of the forest started to blend into one dark wall. That was when I saw it. A figure stood just inside the tree line. It didn't move. It didn't step forward or backward. It just stood there, barely visible, like a tall, narrow shadow that didn't belong to a tree. I froze. My heart started to beat faster. I stayed still, watching it, not blinking. After several seconds, the figure shifted slightly, enough for me to know it was a person, not a trick of the trees. I stepped back from the window slowly. Every movement felt loud in the silent room. I turned off the lamp beside me and sat down on the couch, listening for any sound. Minutes passed. I didn't hear footsteps or branches moving. The figure didn't approach. It simply remained there, half hidden, as if it was watching. I stayed awake the entire night. When the sun finally rose, I checked the tree line again. The figure was gone. The forest looked normal again, but the normal feeling didn't return with it. I felt watched even in daylight. I decided to leave that day. I started packing my things quickly. I moved around the cabin fast, grabbing everything I could. I didn't want to stay another night. Every few minutes I looked out the window, expecting to see someone standing there again. Nothing appeared. As I packed, I noticed something near the back door. The dirt outside was slightly disturbed, like someone had stood there for a long time. The marks led toward the corner of the cabin, where the footsteps from the first night had gone. I felt my chest tighten. I went outside only long enough to confirm it. The prints were real. They weren't mine. I went back inside and locked the door immediately. My hands shook as I finished packing. I grabbed my keys, threw my bag over my shoulder, and walked toward the door. Before I opened it, I looked out the window one more time. That was when I saw something that made my whole body go cold. There were footprints in the dew on the grass. Fresh footprints. They came from the trees. They circled the cabin. They stopped right under the window where I had been sitting the night before. Someone had been standing directly beneath me. I didn't wait any longer. I opened the door, rushed to my car, and unlocked it with shaking hands. As I threw my bag into the passenger seat, my eyes drifted toward the tree line. The figure stood there again, but now closer, not hiding as deeply as before. I didn't look long enough to see details. I jumped into the car, slammed the door shut, and started the engine. Gravel flew behind the tires as I spun the car around and drove down the narrow road as fast as I could without sliding off it. The forest blurred past me. Every bend in the road felt too sharp. Every shadow looked like it was moving. I kept checking the mirrors, expecting to see someone running behind me or stepping out of the trees. When I finally reached the main road, I didn't stop. I drove until the cabin was miles behind me. Only then did I let myself breathe normally. That night, in a motel far from the forest, I checked my bag. At the bottom, Beneath my clothes, there was something that wasn't mine. A folded piece of paper. On it was a single muddy fingerprint, long and narrow, the same size as the smudges on the cabin window. I threw the paper away immediately, but the feeling stayed with me. Still stays with me today. #ending. Clear and detailed. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't report anything because I didn't even know how to explain it without sounding confused or paranoid. But deep down, I know exactly what happened. Someone had been living near that cabin, hiding in the forest, watching anyone who stayed there. They had walked around the property at night. They had stood beneath the window while I slept. They had reached inside my open bag at some point, probably while I had stepped outside or while I slept. They never tried to break in. They never tried to hurt me, but they didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough to make the cabin feel like a trap. If I had stayed one more night, maybe they would have stepped closer. Maybe they would have tried the door. Maybe they were waiting for the right moment. Leaving saved me. I know that for sure. That cabin was not isolated the way I thought it was. It was not empty. Someone else had been there long before me, and they were still there when I left. I went to the cabin because I wanted quiet. I had been feeling burned out for months, and the cabin was the one place where I could sit alone without hearing traffic or dealing with anyone. It was deep in the woods, far from the main road, and the last part of the route was only a narrow dirt path that most cars couldn't pass through. I always brought my old truck because it was the only vehicle I trusted on that rough path. The cabin belonged to my uncle, but he never used it anymore. He let me go there whenever I wanted, and the place had become like a second home for me. The trip was supposed to last 4 days. I brought enough food, water, and basic supplies to stay comfortable. I left early in the morning, and by the time I reached the last stretch of the dirt path, the sun was already bright. I remember thinking how normal everything felt. The woods looked calm. The air felt clean. Nothing seemed wrong. It was the kind of morning that made me think the trip would be easy and peaceful. When I reached the cabin, I parked the truck close to the front steps. The cabin looked the same as always. Dark wood, a metal roof, and a small porch with 2 old chairs. The place always looked a little worn out, but in a way that made it feel lived in. The forest around it was very quiet. There were tall trees on all sides, and the nearest neighbor was at least a mile away. I liked it that way. I wanted to be alone. The first few hours were simple. I carried my bags inside and put everything where I wanted it. I checked the small kitchen and made sure the propane tank still had enough gas. I checked the windows to see if any animals had pushed them open. Everything looked fine. I swept the floor because dust always collected when no one visited for a while. After that, I sat outside for a long time and just listened to the quiet. I remember thinking that I hadn't felt that calm in months. The first strange thing happened that afternoon. I went behind the cabin to gather some small branches for the fire pit. That area always had plenty of fallen wood. But as I walked around, I noticed footprints in the dirt. They weren't mine. They were fresh, clear, and heading toward the cabin from the woods. They looked like boot prints from a normal adult. Nothing unusual about the size or shape. The only thing that bothered me was how fresh they looked, like they had been made that morning. I tried to tell myself the prints could have come from a hunter or a hiker. The woods were big. It wasn't impossible, but something about the direction bothered me. The prints came from deep in the woods and went straight toward the cabin. No prints going away, only toward. I walked around the area a while, following them as far as I could, but the trail stopped when the ground turned rocky. I tried not to think too much about it. I brought the branches to the fire pit and spent the rest of the day keeping myself busy. I cooked a simple meal, read a little, and sat on the porch again as the sun went down. The woods became very dark, the kind of dark where you could barely see past the closest trees. I felt fine at first, but the footprints kept coming back into my mind. I stayed outside a little longer than I should have, staring at the woods and thinking I saw movement far between the trees. I didn't hear anything, but the feeling stayed with me. That night I slept lightly. I woke up several times, not because of sound, but because I kept having the same uneasy feeling. like someone was standing close to the cabin. Every time I opened my eyes, the room was silent. The only sound was the wind moving through the trees. I tried to sleep again, but each time I drifted off, I felt that same pressure on my chest, like I shouldn't be there. When the sun came up, the strange feeling faded a little. I made breakfast and walked outside to check around the cabin again. That's when I saw something that made the uneasiness turn into something heavier. There were more footprints, a second set. This time they weren't behind the cabin. They were in front, close to the porch steps. Fresh again, clear, and pointing directly toward the door. I stood still for a long time. There was no sign of anyone around. No sound, no movement. The woods were still, but those prints were new. They hadn't been there the night before. I would have seen them when I arrived or when I sat on the porch. Someone had walked right up to the cabin while I was inside sleeping. I checked the door. The lock was still in place. I checked the windows. None were broken. Nothing inside the cabin had been touched or moved. But the prints felt like a warning. Someone had been close enough to reach the door, close enough to stand on the porch and look inside if they wanted to. The whole morning felt heavy after that. I tried to focus on small tasks, cleaning the counter, checking the water tank, sweeping again, but everything felt off. Every sound from the woods made me turn my head. I kept expecting to see someone standing between the trees. Around midday, I decided to walk the small path behind the cabin. It led deeper into the woods and eventually connected to a narrow stream. I thought maybe walking would calm me down, but the farther I went, the more uneasy I felt. The woods were too quiet. Even birds seemed to avoid the area that day. The air felt heavy, and each time I stopped walking, it felt like something else stopped at the same time. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there earlier that morning. When I returned to the cabin, I saw something that made every part of my body tense up. There were new prints again. They were right next to the ones I had noticed earlier, but the dirt was softer where the ground stayed shaded. These new prints were even clearer, too clear, like they had been made minutes earlier, and they were facing the woods, not the cabin. Whoever it was had come close, then left again. I looked around the trees, scanning for movement. Nothing, not a single branch shook. But my heart was beating so fast I could feel it in my throat. I didn't want to leave the cabin, but I also didn't want to be inside while someone kept coming back. I decided the best thing was to stay on the porch where I could see the open area around the cabin. I dragged one of the old chairs closer to the steps and sat there with my back straight, watching the woods, waiting for something to move. The hours passed slowly. The sun moved through the sky, and the shadows stretched longer and longer. The whole time, I kept telling myself that the person might just be a random hiker. Maybe they were curious. Maybe they were lost. But the way the footprints looked, direct, purposeful, straight to the cabin and back, it didn't feel like anything random. By late afternoon, the uneasy feeling grew stronger. I didn't want to be outside anymore. I went inside, locked the door, and checked every window again. I made sure the curtains were closed. I kept pacing back and forth, checking every corner of the cabin as if something might be hiding inside, even though I knew that wasn't possible. Night came again, and with it, the darkest silence I had ever felt in those woods. I didn't sleep. I stayed on the bed, listening. Every small sound made me sit up. At one point, I heard a faint crunch outside. Just one step. Not close, but not far either. I held my breath and waited. Nothing followed. But that single crunch stayed in my mind like someone whispering right into my ear. Near dawn, when the light started to creep through the curtains, I finally felt brave enough to check outside again. When I opened the door, I saw exactly what I feared. Another set of footprints. These ones were the closest yet, right at the steps, less than a foot from the door. The prints pointed straight at the cabin again. Someone had stood at the door during the night. I felt sick. My hands were shaking. I couldn't understand why the person kept coming back. They never knocked, never tried the handle. They just approached the cabin again and again, at different times, as if waiting for something. I knew then that I couldn't stay a third night. I didn't care about the rest of my food or the supplies. I packed everything fast. My hands kept slipping. I kept checking the windows, expecting to see someone watching. When I finally stepped outside to load the truck, I checked the woods again and again. Nothing moved. But the footprints, there were so many now. Some older, some fresh, all circling the cabin in different places. Some came from the woods. Some went back into them. Some were close. Some were near the trees. Someone had been walking around the cabin more than I realized. When I drove away, I didn't look back. I kept my eyes on the dirt path until I reached the main road. Only when I saw open land again did I feel my chest loosen. When I got home, I told myself that maybe it had been a lost hiker or some local hunter. I tried to make myself believe it was harmless. But 2 days after I returned, my uncle called me. He had gone to check the cabin because he saw fresh tracks along the path on his way there. He didn't know I had left early, so he thought I might still be around. When he got to the cabin, he found the door scratched. Not broken, not forced, just scratched hard. Right near the handle, like someone had dragged something rough across it. And in the dirt near the steps, he found another set of footprints, fresh again. Someone had gone back after I left. That was the moment everything became clear. Whoever that person was, they hadn't just randomly passed by. They had been watching the cabin, watching me, waiting for times when I wouldn't see them. They kept returning even after I was gone, as if they had been expecting something or following a habit that I didn't understand. I never went back after that. I never asked my uncle to check the place again. I didn't want to know how many more times those footprints showed up. I didn't want to think about how close the person had been, how many hours they had stood only a few feet from where I slept, how many times they circled the cabin quietly in the dark without ever making a sound loud enough for me to hear. The cabin had always felt like a quiet place for me. Now I can't think about it without imagining a stranger standing just out of sight, walking slow circles in the dark, waiting for something that I still don't understand. And the part that never leaves my mind, the footprints never showed two people. Just one set, one person. Whoever they were patient, they were quiet, and they kept coming back. And I know, deep down, if I had stayed one more night, that person might have gotten brave enough to stop standing at the door and finally try to come inside. I chose the cabin because I wanted a quiet place to clear my head. Life had been pulling me in too many directions, and I felt like I had no space left to think. The cabin belonged to a family friend who told me it was empty for the season, and I could stay there as long as I wanted. It sat far back in the woods, miles away from the nearest road, surrounded by tall trees that blocked most of the sky. I liked the idea of being alone. I wanted silence, a place where nobody could distract me. I thought the isolation would help me focus. I didn't think about the problems that could come from being so far away from everything. I didn't think about the fact that nobody would hear me if something went wrong. I was only focused on getting away. I packed enough food for a couple weeks, some clothes, my phone, a battery bank, and a few things I thought I might need. The cabin didn't have electricity, but it did have a wood stove, a couple oil lamps, and a hand pump outside for water. The family friend told me it was old but stable. I liked that. I liked simple things. I liked the idea of a quiet life, even if it was only temporary. The drive out there took nearly 4 hours. Then I had to walk the rest of the way because the forest road was so rough my car couldn't make it. The walk felt longer than it was because the woods were silent in a way that didn't feel normal. No cars, no people, no far-off traffic. Just my footsteps and the sound of small branches snapping under them. The cabin was smaller than I expected. It sat on a slight slope with one window in the front and a small porch with loose boards. The roof sagged a little on one side. The door leaned forward like it was tired, but it looked exactly like the kind of place where someone could finally think straight. I felt a strange comfort when I unlocked it for the first time. Dust floated in the air like tiny particles hanging in slow motion. The smell of old wood and stale air filled the place. There was a small table, a bed with a thin mattress, a wood stove in the corner, and shelves that were mostly empty except for a couple old mugs and a rusty kettle. It wasn't fancy, but it was enough. I settled in fast. I swept the floor, wiped the table, stacked the firewood outside into a neater pile, and unpacked my food. The silence felt heavy at first. I wasn't used to hearing so much nothing. Even when I sat still, my breathing sounded too loud. My mind kept waiting for some background noise that wasn't there. But after a while, it started to feel peaceful. I made a small fire to warm the place, sat at the table, and tried to work on my project. Hours passed. The daylight faded until the cabin turned dim. I lit one of the oil lamps and kept working. For the first time in months, I felt like I was finally getting things done. But that night, before I went to sleep, I noticed something that didn't feel right. The floor near the door had a thin trail of dried mud. Not a lot, just a narrow line about the width of a boot sole. I thought maybe it was mine. Maybe I had brought it in earlier without noticing. But I checked my boots and saw the mud stuck to them was darker and wetter than the dried mud on the floor. I told myself the cabin was old, and maybe the mud had been there already. Maybe I just didn't see it earlier. I didn't want to think too much about it. I brushed it aside with the broom and tried to sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. The woods were so dark outside the window that it felt like the cabin was floating in emptiness. Every small noise made me open my eyes. The creaks of the wood stove cooling down, the wind hitting the walls, the soft tapping of a branch outside. My brain kept trying to make sense of each sound. I lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling until fatigue finally took over and I drifted off. The next morning, things seemed normal again. The air was cold, the light coming through the window was pale, and the trees outside were still. I made a small fire, warmed some canned food, and went outside to pump water. The forest looked different in daylight. It didn't seem as heavy or threatening. I thought maybe I just wasn't used to the silence yet. I encouraged myself not to overthink. But when I came back into the cabin, the broom was on the floor. I remembered leaving it in the corner leaning against the wall. I didn't rush or bump anything when I went outside. The door had been closed. There was no wind strong enough to knock it down, but it lay in the middle of the room like someone had carried it and dropped it. I stared at it for a long time. Something felt off. I felt a pressure in my chest that I didn't like. But again, I forced myself to believe it was nothing. I told myself the floor was uneven. Maybe I placed the broom wrong. Maybe it slid and fell over while I was outside. I tried to continue with my day. I sat at the table and focused on my work, forcing myself to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. I told myself being alone was supposed to feel strange at first. People live in noise their whole lives, and when they finally sit somewhere quiet, their minds fill the silence with things that aren't there. I tried to believe that, but the feeling didn't go away. It got stronger. Every now and then, I would look up from my work and scan the room like I was expecting something to be different. I didn't know what I was looking for. I just felt watched, even though I knew no one was there. The woods outside remained still. The trees didn't move unless the wind pushed them. But the feeling followed me around like something hanging over my shoulder. Later in the afternoon, I decided to take a small walk to clear my head. I followed a deer trail that curved behind the cabin and led deeper into the woods. The trees were tall and spaced just far enough apart to let light go through in long, thin beams. The ground was covered in leaves and pine needles. My footsteps made soft, crunching sounds that echoed quietly. As I moved farther away from the cabin, the air grew colder and the forest darker. About 15 minutes into the walk, I stopped to look around. The silence felt different here. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy in a way that made me feel like I shouldn't be there. I turned back and walked toward the cabin again. Halfway back, something caught my eye. Footprints. Not mine. They were faint, but clear enough in the softer soil near the trees. A straight path heading toward the cabin, coming from deeper in the woods. The prints were old enough to lose their sharpness but recent enough not to be washed away. I felt my heart tighten. I hadn't seen anyone since I arrived. There were no neighbors nearby, no hikers, no hunters, nobody who should have been walking toward the cabin. I followed the footprints for a few yards until they became too faint to see clearly. They came from the dark part of the forest I had turned away from, the part that made me feel watched. I stood there for a moment, trying to understand what I was looking at. Then I walked faster toward the cabin. When I reached the porch, I froze. The door was slightly open. I knew I had closed it. I remembered pushing it hard until the latch clicked. I walked inside slowly, listening for any sound. The cabin looked the same as before, but something felt different in the air. Something felt disturbed. I checked each corner, the small bathroom, the tiny storage room. Nobody was there. Nothing was taken. Nothing was broken. But something had been moved. The oil lamp that I left on the table was now on the floor near the bed. The notebook I was writing in wasn't on the table either. It was on the chair, open to a page I hadn't written on yet. The food box I kept near the wall was slightly open. My bag was leaning in a different angle than before. Nothing dramatic, nothing violent, just small changes. But small changes were enough. Someone had been inside. Someone had walked through the woods, reached the cabin, gone inside while I was gone, touched my things and left. I felt a deep sense of panic spreading in my chest. My hands shook. My breathing changed. I closed and locked the door even though I knew it wouldn't help much. The lock was tiny and old. Anyone strong enough could push through it. I sat at the table and tried to calm myself. But fear took over my thoughts like a heavy fog stretching across my mind. I didn't want to leave right away. The walk back to the road was long, and the sun was already starting to drop. I knew it would be dangerous to walk through the woods in the dark. The forest floor was uneven, and it would be easy to twist an ankle or lose the path. I told myself I would stay one more night but stay alert. First thing in the morning, I would pack everything and leave. But I didn't feel safe anymore. I kept checking the window. Every time the wind moved the trees, my heart jumped. Every time the cabin creaked, my body tensed. I couldn't focus on anything. I felt trapped inside that small wooden room with thin walls and no real security. As evening came, the temperature dropped fast. I lit the oil lamp, made a small fire in the stove, and sat on the bed with my back against the wall so I could see the whole room. I didn't want to sleep. I didn't want to close my eyes. I felt like someone could be outside watching the cabin. I kept listening for footsteps or branches snapping. I kept expecting the door to move or the window to shake. Hours passed like that. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to a faint sound. A soft scraping sound came from the porch. I sat still, barely breathing. The sound stopped. Then I heard another noise. Lighter this time, almost like a footstep. I felt chills run up my back. I didn't move. I didn't blink. The only thing I could hear was my heart pounding. The sound stopped again. I stared at the door for what felt like an hour, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. After a while, I stood up and moved quietly to the oil lamp. I lowered the flame to make the room dimmer. I didn't want whoever was outside to see me clearly through the window. I sat back down and waited. I didn't sleep again that night. The sky eventually turned lighter. The night shifted into a cold, gray morning. I grabbed my bag and packed everything fast. I didn't eat. I didn't drink. I just wanted to leave. I stepped outside and looked around. The forest was damp and silent. The footprints from yesterday were still faintly visible. But now there were new ones, fresh ones. They circled the cabin. They went around the back, stopped near the window, then went off into the woods. Someone had been watching the cabin during the night. I forced myself not to freeze. I forced myself to start moving. I walked fast, clutching my bag tightly, looking over my shoulder every few seconds. The path felt different now. The trees felt taller, the shadows darker. Every sound made me jump. Birds, branches, leaves. Everything sounded like footsteps. I kept going. My breathing turned sharp. I couldn't tell if I was cold or scared or both. Halfway to the road, I found something that made me stop. A jacket. An old, dirty jacket hanging on a low branch like someone placed it there on purpose. It wasn't mine. It was too big for me. The sleeves were torn. The fabric was stained with dirt and something darker that looked old. I didn't touch it. I walked faster. Then I found something worse. A small piece of paper sticking out from under a rock on the trail. It wasn't there when I arrived. I pulled it out carefully. There was writing on it, scribbled in shaky letters. The writing didn't make full sense, but it looked like someone was trying to say they lived in the woods, that they were watching the cabin, that they wanted to know who I was. My chest tightened. I put the paper down and kept walking, almost running. When I reached the road, I felt a small relief, but it didn't last. The road was empty, surrounded by trees on both sides. My car was far away. I knew I still had a long walk ahead. I started moving along the dirt road, trying to stay in the center so I could see in all directions. The forest felt like it was closing in. The silence was too thick. Every few minutes, I looked behind me. First, nothing seemed wrong. But then, in the distance, I thought I saw movement. Something dark, something low to the ground, something that moved behind a group of trees and disappeared. I didn't stay to get a better look. I kept walking faster. My legs hurt. My throat burned. My bag felt heavier with every passing minute. The road curved and dipped, and every bend felt like a trap. I felt like someone was following me. Not running, not moving loudly, just keeping distance. When my car finally came into view, I felt weak with relief. I fumbled with the keys because my hands were shaking. I opened the door, threw my bag inside, and started the engine. I didn't look behind me. I didn't want to see if someone was standing at the tree line. I didn't want any more images stuck in my mind. I drove until I reached a main road. Then I drove more. I didn't stop for hours. I didn't eat. I didn't drink. I only stopped when I reached a town far from the woods. I parked in a public lot near a small grocery store, sat in the car, and tried to breathe. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I checked my phone. I hadn't had a signal the whole time in the woods, but now it was full. I thought about telling someone, the police maybe, but I didn't know what to say. Nobody touched me. Nobody stole anything. Nobody left clear threats. But someone had been in the cabin. Someone watched me. Someone walked around the woods at night. Someone left footprints, moved my things, circled the cabin, and left a jacket and a note. Someone followed me. I didn't know who. I didn't know why. I drove home that same day. Even after I left the forest far behind, the feeling stayed with me. For the next few nights, I barely slept. Every sound in my house felt threatening. The refrigerator hum, the pipes, the floor settling. Everything made me think someone had followed me home. But nothing happened. Days passed, then a week, then more. Slowly, the fear faded. I stopped checking the windows every hour. I stopped waking up in the middle of the night with my heart racing. I tried to tell myself that maybe the person in the woods wasn't dangerous. Maybe they lived out there. Maybe they didn't understand I was only staying temporarily. Maybe they were curious and not violent. But that explanation never settled right with me. It didn't make sense. People who live in the woods away from everyone don't usually walk into cabins and move things silently. They don't leave strange notes. They don't circle cabins in the middle of the night. Months passed without anything happening, but the memory stayed sharp, like it happened only days ago. Sometimes, when I'm out walking at night near my house, I think I hear footsteps behind me. When I go to throw garbage out late at night, I sometimes feel someone watching from the dark areas near the streetlights. It never lasts long. When I turn, nothing is there. I moved apartments eventually. I told myself I just wanted a fresh start. But deep down, I know the real reason. I didn't like the idea that maybe the person in the woods found something with my info. Maybe they followed me. Maybe they watched from a distance. Maybe they lost interest eventually. Or maybe they didn't. I never went back to the cabin. I never asked the family friend about it. I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want to hear stories of other strange things happening there. I didn't want confirmation of anything. But the ending is clear. Something was living in those woods. Something that wasn't supposed to be near people. Something that didn't want to be seen. And I know, without any doubt, that if I had stayed one more night, if I had ignored the footprints, or the moved objects, or the sounds on the porch, things would have ended in a completely different way. I left just in time, and whoever was out there knows that too. I drove to the cabin late in the afternoon, following the narrow dirt road that twisted through the trees. The weather felt colder than the forecast said, and the clouds hung low, making the sky look heavy and dark even though it was still early. I felt tired from the long drive, and all I wanted was a quiet night alone inside the place I had rented. It was small, just one room with a bathroom, an old deck, and a shed behind it. The listing said it used to be a hunting cabin, so I expected it to be rough and simple. That did not bother me. I wanted the silence more than anything else. When I reached the cabin, I parked the car close to the front steps. The trees around it looked squeezed together, blocking most of the light. The cabin looked older than it did in the pictures, with faded wood and a thin metal roof that made soft ticking sounds from the cold air. A stack of chopped firewood sat beside the steps. I grabbed my bags from the car, locked it, and walked inside. The air inside smelled old, like wood soaked in years of smoke. There was one small window facing the trees. I unpacked slowly, placing everything neatly, wanting to settle in the space. I felt a little uneasy, but that always happened when I stayed somewhere isolated. The silence felt too strong at first, like everything around me was waiting for something. I tried to ignore that feeling and went outside again to check around the property before it got dark. Behind the cabin was a small shed with a rusted padlock. It looked like no one had used it for years. The forest around the cabin was thick, with shrubs growing so close that I could not see far. The ground was covered in dead leaves. I walked around the property slowly, only stopping when I felt the cold air starting to bite at my hands. I went back inside when the sky finally turned dark. I set up my small portable heater near the bed, then heated a can of food on the little stove. I ate quietly while listening to the wind pressing against the walls. The heater hummed softly. I tried to relax, but the silence outside kept pulling my attention. There were no nearby houses, no cars, no voices. Just darkness, trees, and the sound of the cold wind sliding through them. I got ready to sleep early, hoping I would feel more comfortable in the morning. I climbed into the bed under the thick blanket and stared at the ceiling. My body felt tired enough to sleep, but my mind kept running. I tried to breathe slowly and ignore the noises outside. I knew forests made sounds at night. Branches moved, animals walked. The wind pushed against everything. None of it meant danger, but the silence between those sounds made me feel exposed, like the cabin was too thin to protect me from everything outside. I closed my eyes and finally drifted into sleep. I woke up later, maybe around midnight. The cabin was cold. The heater had shut off. The air felt heavy and wet, and I felt like someone had shaken me awake even though nothing had touched me. I lay still under the blanket, listening. A faint sound drifted through the window. It was soft and slow, like leaves being pushed aside. I stayed silent, waiting for it to come again, but minutes passed with nothing but the faint whistle of the wind. I reached over, turned the heater back on, and stared at the window. My eyes were still heavy, and I tried to convince myself that the noise was just an animal, probably a deer or a raccoon. The forest was full of them. There was no reason to think it was anything else. I fell asleep again, deeper this time. When I woke in the morning, the light outside was gray and dim. The cold was still strong. I sat up slowly, rubbed my eyes, and let myself adjust to the quiet. Everything looked normal. Nothing seemed disturbed. I made some instant coffee and stepped out onto the deck. That was when I noticed the footprints. Not animal prints, human ones. They were pressed into the soft dirt around the right side of the cabin, leading between the trees before vanishing deeper into the forest. They looked fresh. The edges were sharp. They were definitely not mine. They were bigger, and the pattern on the sole looked different from my own boots. A cold feeling spread through my chest. I tried to calm myself by thinking that maybe a hiker had wandered close to the property. The forest trails were not too far away. Someone could have passed by. It did not mean anything dangerous, but the prints were close to the cabin, too close. Only a few meters from the window I had slept beside. I walked around the cabin, following the prints carefully. They circled toward the back, near the old shed. The ground behind the shed was covered in thick leaves, so I lost the trail there, but the idea of someone walking behind the cabin at night made my stomach tighten. I checked the shed, but the padlock was still on and covered in rust. I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to shake the uneasy feeling. I told myself that staying calm was the only thing that made sense. Stressing over footprints would not solve anything. The day passed slowly. I stayed mostly inside, reading on my phone, drinking more coffee, and trying not to think about the prints. Near the afternoon, I forced myself to walk outside again to get fresh air. I stuck close to the cabin. Nothing seemed out of place anymore. There were no new prints. The forest looked normal again, silent and empty. When night came again, the wind grew stronger, and the trees creaked in the gusts. I ate a simple meal, set up the heater, and tried to settle into bed early. But I kept thinking about the prints. I kept imagining someone walking around outside, watching the cabin in the dark. Every time the wind pushed against the wall, I felt myself tense up. I eventually fell asleep, but it did not last long. Sometime later, I woke again. I did not know why. The cabin was completely silent at first. Then I heard it, slow footsteps on the dead leaves near the back of the cabin. The steps were heavy, too heavy to be an animal. They were spaced widely, like someone walked with long strides. I held my breath and stayed perfectly still. The footsteps grew closer, moving around the side of the cabin, near the window. The heater hummed softly beside me, and that sound felt like the only thing keeping me grounded. The steps stopped for a moment right outside. I stared at the dark window, waiting for movement, but I saw nothing. After several long seconds, the footsteps moved again, slower this time, toward the back of the cabin. Then they faded away completely. It took a long time for me to move again. When I finally did, I reached out and turned off the heater because I wanted to hear everything more clearly. My breath came out shaky in the cold air. I decided to stay awake until morning. I lay there with my eyes open, listening to the wind and waiting for any more sounds. But the footsteps never returned. When morning came, I still felt the tightness in my chest. I got up, stepped outside, and saw new footprints circling the cabin again. They followed almost the same path as before but were deeper this time, like the person had moved slower or leaned down near the window. I knew I should leave, but the idea of hiking down the long road alone scared me even more. I felt safer inside the cabin during the day, where I could lock the door and stay alert. The rest of the day passed in a blur of anxiety. I kept checking the window, pacing inside the cabin, and listening for sounds. I could not relax. Every little noise made me jump. The shadows between the trees felt too still, as if something was standing in them, waiting for the light to die. By the time the sun began to set again, I felt exhausted but too scared to even think about sleeping. I heated some food, but I barely ate any of it. I kept staring at the door, imagining someone trying the handle, pressing their hand against the window, looking inside to see if I was awake. The darkness gathered quickly. The cabin felt like it was shrinking around me. I turned on the heater but kept all the lights off except a small lamp on the table. I wanted the inside to stay dim so no one could see me clearly from outside. The wind rattled the thin walls harder than before, and small branches tapped against the roof. I sat on the edge of the bed, hugging the blanket around my arms, listening to the forest breathe outside. My nerves felt like wires pulled too tight. Hours passed. Nothing happened. Then, around what felt like midnight, I heard the shed. Not footsteps, not leaves. A quiet metallic clink, the sound of the padlock moving. I froze. The sound came again, softer this time, like someone trying not to make noise while pulling on the lock. I did not want to move, but I slowly stood up and turned off the small lamp. I stood there in the dark, heart pounding, staring through the window even though I could not see anything outside. The metallic sound stopped. Silence filled every corner of the cabin. I waited for something else. A footstep, breathing, anything, but the silence stretched on. I stood there for several minutes before I slowly sat on the floor where I could see the door and window at the same time. I hugged my knees to my chest, keeping myself small and quiet. The night felt endless. At some point, I must have drifted in and out of shallow sleep while sitting up. I woke again near dawn, light barely touching the trees. The cold air felt sharp in my nose. My body felt stiff and cramped. I waited until it was brighter outside before stepping onto the deck. The air felt strangely still. I walked slowly toward the shed. The padlock was gone. It lay on the ground beside the shed door, cut cleanly through the middle with some kind of tool. The shed door was slightly open. My whole body felt cold. I stood still, staring at the open gap. After several seconds, I stepped forward and pushed the door wider. Inside, the shed was almost empty. Just old shelves, some dusty tools, a broken chair, and a stack of empty crates. Everything looked untouched except for the far corner, where the dust on the floor had been disturbed. There were footprints inside. Someone had been standing in the shed, probably watching the cabin from the cracks in the wood. I backed away quickly and returned to the cabin. I felt dizzy from fear. I knew I could not stay another night. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed my things into it without caring how messy it was, and got ready to leave. But then I opened the door, and I froze again. There were fresh footprints on the front steps. They were facing the door, as if someone had stood there while I slept, maybe only an hour earlier. I looked around the trees carefully, but everything was still. No movement, no sounds, just the quiet forest. I unlocked my car with shaking hands, started the engine, and slowly backed away from the cabin. My eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone step out of the trees. The road felt longer than before. Every branch that moved in the wind made me jump. When I finally reached the main road, I felt my chest loosen for the first time in 2 days. I kept driving for hours before I stopped at a gas station. I went inside the bathroom and stared at myself in the mirror. My eyes looked tired and stressed, like I had not slept in days. I never went back to that cabin. I reported the footprints and the cut lock to the rental owner, but they said they had no idea who it could have been. Maybe someone living in the forest illegally. Maybe a hunter passing through. Maybe someone using abandoned sheds to stay warm. I did not care who it was. All I knew was that someone had been walking around that cabin every night, watching it, circling it, checking the shed, standing at the door and getting bolder each time. And the worst part was knowing that if I had not woken up early that last morning, if I had slept longer, if I had waited until noon to leave, the person could have been close. Maybe even inside the shed, waiting for the right moment. The ending was clear to me the moment I drove away. The cabin was never the scary part. The forest was never the scary part. The scary part was the person who knew I was alone, who walked close enough to breathe near the window, who stood at the door while I slept, and who was waiting for the night when I was too tired or too careless to stay awake. And the scariest thought was something I still think about sometimes late at night. They probably watched me leave. I reached the cabin just before sunset, driving the last stretch of rough mountain road that was already turning icy as the temperature dropped. The whole place looked abandoned from the outside, even though I had rented it online weeks before. The small wooden structure sat low between tall pines, and the snow around it looked untouched except for a few faint marks that might have been from an animal. The air felt still in a way that made me feel like the whole valley was holding its breath. I stepped out of the car and instantly felt the cold pushing against my face, the kind that slips through the smallest openings of your clothes. I carried my bags inside after pushing the stiff door open. The place smelled like old wood, dust, and the faint scent of cold air that had seeped in through the cracks. There was one small room with a bed, a tiny kitchen area, and a narrow hallway that led to a bathroom. Everything felt tight and boxed in, but I told myself it would be fine for a few days. I wanted quiet. I wanted space from people. I thought the isolation would help me clear my head. I spent the first hour wandering through the cabin, checking the windows and trying to get the small heater working. It rattled and groaned before finally pushing out warm air that slowly spread through the room. I unpacked my things and placed them around the room, trying to make the place feel a bit more lived in so it wouldn't feel so empty. By the time it was fully dark outside, the wind had started to move through the trees. It wasn't strong, but it had that sound that rises and sinks like something walking around the cabin walls, even though I knew it was just branches moving. I made a simple meal with what I had brought with me, and I sat on the bed while eating, looking toward the window every few seconds without even meaning to. I could see nothing but darkness outside, even when I leaned closer. I turned off the lights after a while and got into bed. The sheets felt cold, and the mattress felt harder than I expected. I lay there listening to the wind and the occasional soft cracking noise from the wooden frame of the cabin adjusting to the cold. I began to drift off when I heard something outside. Something short, quick, and clear. It was a crunch on the snow. A single step. I held my breath and listened harder. The wind faded for a moment, allowing silence to fill the room. Then I heard it again. A second crunch. Then another. Slow. Measured. Someone stepping around the cabin. I didn't move. I stared at the ceiling and tried to steady my breathing, but it kept coming out uneven. I waited to hear if maybe the steps belonged to some animal. But the steps were too heavy, too spaced out, and too controlled. They sounded human. I lay completely still, counting each step as it moved from one side of the cabin to the other. Then everything went quiet again, and I wasn't sure if the person had walked away or was standing still outside. I didn't sleep for a long time after that. I just kept listening, waiting for another sound. When morning came, I got dressed quickly and stepped outside. The cold morning air burned my lungs. I walked around the cabin slowly, checking the snow around it. That's when I saw the footprints. They weren't mine. They circled the entire cabin in a slow, looping trail. The size of the prints told me the person had been wearing boots. The pattern of the steps told me they had moved with intention, not wandering randomly. I followed the tracks a little way until they disappeared into the forest. I didn't want to go any deeper than that. The sun was barely warming the air, and the woods looked darker and thicker than they had the day before. I went back inside and tried to calm the rising pressure in my chest. I told myself it could have been a hiker who got curious or someone from another cabin, but I had seen no other houses during my drive. The road I took was the only one leading into this part of the valley, and this cabin was the only rental listed for miles. The thought settled heavily on me. I tried to distract myself during the day. I chopped some wood that was stacked outside, cleaned the cabin, and heated more water to wash up. But no matter what I did, I kept looking out the windows, expecting to see someone standing among the trees. As the sky darkened again, I felt more nervous than the night before. I made sure the door was locked, checked the windows twice, and moved a small wooden chair under the doorknob even though the lock worked. When the last bit of daylight was gone, the darkness outside looked deeper than anything I had seen before. The trees formed a black wall around the cabin. I was lying on the bed again with the small lamp on when the first sound came. It was faint, like something brushing against the outside corner of the cabin. I sat up, heart pounding. Then I heard another noise. The same slow crunch of snow. Then another. A pattern I recognized from the night before. Someone was circling the cabin again. I turned off the lamp and sat in the dark, hoping that if the person couldn't see light inside, they would think no one was home. The steps came closer. Each one felt louder than the last. They moved around the cabin slowly, following the same path as the prints I had seen earlier. I leaned forward and held my breath as I listened. I felt every tiny sound as if the noise was happening inside the room. Then the steps stopped. They stopped right outside the window. I could feel the weight of whoever was standing there even without seeing them. I imagined the person standing only inches away from the thin wall, breathing in the cold air, listening for movement inside. The silence lasted so long that my muscles started to ache from staying still. Then the steps began again, but this time they were moving away. Slowly but steadily until the sound faded completely. I waited for almost an hour before I turned the lamp back on. Sleep was impossible. My mind kept replaying every detail of the sound. I kept picturing someone's face right outside the window glass even though I never saw them. I sat awake until morning, staring out at the pale light pushing into the valley. The next day, I found the new prints in the snow. They traced the same circle around the cabin, but this time they stopped at the windows. The prints were deep, showing the person had stood there for a while. I followed them again into the woods, but this time the tracks went farther before disappearing. It looked like the person had walked deeper into the forest, almost as if they had been watching the cabin from a distance during the day. The thought made me feel sick. I wanted to leave right then, but the snow had gotten heavier overnight. The road out of the valley would be covered, and my car wasn't suited for deep snow. I knew if I got stuck halfway up the road, I would be in an even worse position. I convinced myself to stay one more night and leave first thing in the morning before the snow got even thicker. All day I kept checking outside. I barely ate. I barely sat still. The pressure in my chest kept tightening, and the cold seemed to seep in deeper no matter how high I turned the heater. As soon as it got dark again, I felt like I was waiting for something. My body was tired, but my mind was tense. I kept staring at the windows, listening for the first sound of footsteps. It didn't take long. This time the steps came earlier, before I even got into bed. I heard them start on the far side of the cabin, slow and steady. Then they moved along the wall opposite me, the wall with the small kitchen window. I stared at the window's shape in the dark, waiting to hear the steps reach it. They reached the window and stopped. This time the person didn't leave after a few seconds. The steps stayed still right outside, like the person was pressing as close to the cabin wall as they could. I felt a cold sweat on my back as I sat completely still. I tried to keep my breathing quiet, but my chest kept tightening, making me breathe faster. After what felt like a long time, I heard a new sound. The faintest tap on the window. Not a knock, more like a fingertip testing the glass. Then another tap. Then nothing. I didn't move for over an hour. The steps never moved away. The person stayed outside the window the entire time. My muscles shook from staying still, and I could feel my heartbeat in my neck. When morning finally came and the gray light crept into the sky, the steps had long faded away, but I didn't know when they had left. When I stepped outside, my breath froze in the air. The prints went right up to the window and stayed there in a deep impression where the person had stood for a long time. The snow around the cabin looked disturbed, like the person had slowly shifted their weight from one foot to the other during the night. I didn't waste time. I packed everything as fast as I could, barely checking if I had forgotten anything. I loaded the car, brushed the snow off the windshield with shaking hands, and started the engine. I kept looking toward the tree line, expecting to see someone standing there. The woods looked silent, but not empty. Driving out of the valley took longer than it should have. The snow was deeper than the day before, and the tires kept slipping on the icy patches. I kept checking the rearview mirror to make sure no one was behind me, even though I knew the chances of someone following me through that deep snow were low. When I finally reached the main road miles away, I felt like I had been holding my breath the entire time. The tension didn't disappear right away. It stayed with me for days, settling into my body in a way that made it hard to relax. The ending became clear to me when I looked back at the experience from a distance. Nothing supernatural had happened. There were no strange creatures or ghostly figures. It was a real person, someone who had gone out of their way to reach an isolated cabin in the snowy valley. Someone who had quietly circled the place night after night, stepping up to the windows and standing there in the dark, watching, waiting, listening. The scariest part was that I never found out who it was or what they wanted. There were no reports in the area, no missing people that fit the situation, no explanation from any local authorities. It was just someone who chose that cabin, chose that moment, and chose to stay in the cold night staring inside. The only clear ending was that I left before they did anything worse. If I had stayed another night, things might have gone in a direction I don't want to imagine. The memory of those slow steps circling the cabin stayed with me long after I reached safety, reminding me how real fear becomes when it comes from another human being who hides in the dark and takes their time while you lie awake, waiting for the next sound. I had planned this trip for months. I had been reading about small, remote cabins tucked deep into the woods, places where no one went for days, sometimes weeks. I wanted isolation, a place where I could be alone with my thoughts, where I could hike and fish and just disappear from the world for a while. I found a small wooden cabin in the northern forest, off a barely marked dirt road. The pictures online showed a simple structure, old but sturdy, with a stone chimney and a small clearing around it. I booked it, paid for it, and planned my drive and supplies carefully. I wanted everything to be perfect. The drive there was long. I left early in the morning, and the highway eventually turned into gravel and then dirt. The deeper I went, the narrower the road became, with trees crowding close on either side, their branches almost brushing the roof of my car. I noticed fewer signs of human life, no houses, no mailboxes, no other vehicles. By the time I reached the place where the GPS insisted the cabin was, I realized I had to leave my car and walk the last stretch. The trail leading to the cabin was barely visible, covered with leaves and branches. I parked, grabbed my backpack, and started walking, following the directions the owner had sent me. It took me about an hour to reach the cabin. When I arrived, I felt relief and excitement. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures, but smaller, and the surrounding forest made it seem more remote than I imagined. The clearing around it was quiet except for the occasional bird or rustle of leaves in the wind. I carried my things inside. The interior was simple: one room with a small wood stove, a narrow bed, a table with 2 chairs, and a small shelf with dishes. The air smelled faintly of old wood and damp earth. I placed my things carefully, unpacked, and decided to take a walk around the clearing to familiarize myself with the area. The forest was thick. The trees were tall and the underbrush dense. I could hear twigs snapping under my boots, and every few minutes, I would stop to listen to the wind or a distant animal. There were deer tracks, perhaps a rabbit trail, and the occasional mark of a bear or coyote. The cabin was visible from only a few angles. From most spots in the clearing, it was hidden by trees. I felt a strange mixture of awe and nervousness. I was truly alone. I liked it. I spent the first day exploring the nearby woods, noting a small stream a short distance from the cabin. I marked it in my memory, thinking about fishing or washing. The sun was fading when I returned, and I built a small fire outside, cooking some food over it. The forest was calm, except for the usual night sounds: the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, and the occasional snap of branches. I felt content. I slept well that night, though I left the cabin door unlocked slightly, a habit I had from urban life, thinking nothing of it. The second day, I decided to explore further. I wanted to see if I could reach a ridge that the map suggested was nearby. The trail was difficult, full of fallen branches and loose dirt. I had to climb over logs and wade through small patches of water. By mid-afternoon, I reached the ridge. From there, the view was incredible. Trees stretching as far as I could see, the sun glittering off a river far below. I stayed there for a while, breathing in the clean air and feeling the isolation. I made my way back before sunset, careful to remember landmarks. As I approached the cabin, I noticed something unusual: a set of footprints in the dirt, leading from the edge of the clearing to the cabin. They were too large for me, and I realized with a sudden jolt that they weren't mine. They were fresh. The dirt was still soft in some areas. I froze, trying to listen, but I heard nothing else. No voices, no other movement, just the wind. My heart raced. I double-checked the cabin windows and doors. Everything seemed normal. The lock was intact. Still, the footprints were unnerving. I told myself it could be an animal, though I knew humans left prints like that. I kept the fire going that night, and I stayed awake longer than usual, watching the shadows of the trees flicker in the firelight. The next morning, I woke early and inspected the area more carefully. The footprints were still there, faint now because of the night frost, but I could see the shape clearly. They led into the cabin and stopped. I checked everything again. Nothing was out of place, nothing was missing, and nothing seemed disturbed. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the owner or a caretaker had come by to check the cabin and I didn't notice. But the idea made me uneasy. I spent the morning cleaning the cabin, stocking firewood, and preparing for another hike. I wanted to put the footprints out of my mind. Later that afternoon, I noticed something else. As I was sitting outside, I heard the faint sound of movement behind the trees. A footstep on dry leaves, distant but deliberate. I froze. It was too rhythmic, too consistent for an animal. I stayed still, straining to see through the dense forest. I couldn't see anything. The sound stopped after a few seconds. I wanted to leave immediately, but I felt stubborn. I told myself I was overreacting, maybe the wind or a branch falling. I went inside and stayed near the window, keeping watch. I considered leaving, but I had driven so far and prepared so much. I told myself I could stay another night. That night, I made sure to lock every door and window. I left a small light on inside and another outside near the fire pit. I sat in the corner of the cabin, quietly listening. The forest was alive with night sounds, but nothing seemed unusual. Hours passed. I began to feel more relaxed, thinking perhaps my imagination had gotten the better of me. I fell asleep eventually, though lightly, with my eyes half open. The next morning, I noticed signs of someone being near the cabin again. A small branch was broken at waist height, as if someone had pushed through the underbrush. Footprints again, leading from the forest to the clearing. My stomach tightened. This time, I didn't try to rationalize it. Someone had been close, perhaps watching. I spent the morning reinforcing the cabin as best as I could, making sure the doors locked solidly, piling stones in front of windows, clearing branches that could hide someone approaching. I took a long, careful look around the clearing. There was no one, but the feeling remained. I could not shake the sense that I was being observed. The isolation that once felt peaceful now felt threatening. I spent the next few days cautiously exploring the surrounding area, always noting my path, always returning before dark. The forest was beautiful but intimidating, and I became acutely aware of sounds, shadows, and movement. I noticed more subtle signs. Broken twigs near the trail, footprints partially hidden under leaves, and once, an overturned rock near the stream. Each time I discovered something, my tension increased, but I tried to remain calm. I told myself not to panic. Panic would lead to mistakes. I had to be rational. I started carrying a small hatchet in one hand when I went outside, and I kept a flashlight and knife on my person at all times. Then, one evening, everything changed. I had returned from a short hike, arriving at the cabin just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky was darkening fast, and I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The cabin door, which I was certain I had locked earlier, was slightly ajar. Not open fully, just cracked. My heart raced. I had checked it multiple times. I approached slowly, keeping low, watching the surrounding trees. No movement. I pushed the door gently with my foot. Inside, the cabin was mostly as I had left it, but the small pile of firewood I had stacked neatly was scattered across the floor. My supplies were untouched, but the disruption was enough to send adrenaline rushing through me. Someone had been inside. Very recently. I looked out the window, no one, no footprints, just the forest, quiet and still. I decided to stay inside and wait, but the night passed without further incident. I slept fitfully, the hatchet close beside me, the knife under my pillow. The following day, I made a critical decision. I had to leave. The forest, which had seemed like a sanctuary, had become threatening. I packed quickly, moving methodically, not leaving anything behind that might slow me down. I inspected the cabin one last time, making sure not to touch anything more than necessary. As I walked toward the trail to my car, I noticed something disturbing. More footprints in the dirt, larger than mine, fresh, leading from the direction of the cabin toward the road. Someone had followed me during the night or early morning, hiding in the forest. I moved quickly, keeping my eyes on the path ahead and listening for movement behind me. I could hear faint snaps of branches, rustling leaves, but I didn't dare turn. I ran the last stretch to my car, my backpack heavy on my shoulders, my heart pounding. I reached the car, locked the doors immediately, and started the engine. For the first time, the forest seemed endless as I drove out, watching the shadows and trees, half expecting someone to appear from the underbrush. I didn't stop until I reached the highway, a place with other cars, other people, and signs of civilization. Only then did I allow myself to breathe. I never returned to that cabin. Later, I learned from local sources that there had been a person in the woods who had been living off the land, hiding in abandoned structures, sometimes following visitors. No one knew exactly who he was, but his presence explained everything. The footprints, the disturbances, the sense of being watched. It was terrifying, knowing I had been so close without realizing it. The incident stayed with me. Even now, years later, I can picture the forest, the cabin, and those silent footsteps in the dirt. I am cautious about isolation now, and I always consider the possibility that someone may be near, watching, waiting, even in the most remote places. That cabin taught me the lesson in the most direct way. Nature is not always peaceful, and solitude can be dangerous when someone else is sharing the space without your knowledge. I learned to respect isolation, to always be prepared, and never underestimate the presence of other humans, even when none are visible. The memory of that trip remains vivid, a warning etched into my mind, a reminder that danger often comes not from what you imagine, but from what is quietly real. I never planned to spend the night alone in that cabin. It was supposed to be a short stop, something I would use for a few hours before going back down the narrow trail that cut through the thick forest. I had taken time off from everything after weeks of stress and noise and people crowding every part of my day. I wanted quiet, open space, air that felt fresh instead of recycled, and a place where I did not have to think about my phone, my schedule, or the tight feeling behind my eyes. So I drove for hours until the city lights were far behind me and the road turned from smooth black asphalt into a rough and uneven stretch of dirt that made my car shake every few meters. The cabin belonged to someone I barely knew. It was the brother of an old coworker who used it only in winter. I got the keys through the coworker, and that was it. No rules, no warnings, no prepared welcome. Just a set of keys in a plastic bag and a rough idea of where the cabin should be. I did not even know what shape it was or how big it would be. All I knew was that it sat somewhere near a lake and that nobody went there except the owner during winter for hunting. That was enough for me. When I reached the clearing where the cabin stood, the sun was already dropping behind the trees. The light stretched long across the ground, making the trees look taller and the shadows stretch across the clearing like thick black ropes. The cabin looked old but stable. The walls were dark from years of weather. The roof sagged just a little near one corner but looked strong enough. There was a single small deck in the front, covered in dry leaves that had collected over who knows how long. The windows were dusty and the lock on the door looked stiff. I could already feel the air cooling as night approached. I stepped inside and stood still for a moment. The interior smelled old, like wood soaked in rain for many years mixed with dust that had settled into every crack. The air felt thick from being closed for so long. I walked through the small space, moving slowly as my eyes adjusted. The cabin had only one main room with a small half-wall dividing the kitchen area from the sleeping area. The bed had an old thin mattress with a blanket folded at the end. The kitchen had a metal sink and a small wooden counter that looked rough from knives scraping against it. A single shelf above the sink held a few empty jars. The floor creaked under my shoes with every step. Everything looked untouched for months. I opened the windows a little to let in some fresh air. The forest smell immediately pushed into the cabin. Pine, damp soil, old leaves, and cool evening air. Felt good at first. Quiet. Still. I told myself this was exactly what I needed. I unpacked only a few things. A small backpack, some food, a flashlight, and a folding knife. I placed everything on the counter and looked around again. I thought the place would feel safe once I settled in, but something about the silence felt different here. It wasn't peaceful silence. It felt heavy. Something about it made me more aware of every small sound I made. As it grew darker outside, the forest changed. The birds that had been making noise earlier went quiet. The wind began to push harder against the trees, making the branches move and scrape gently against one another. The cabin itself reacted to the cooling air, shrinking slightly with small soft cracks that echoed inside the empty space. I sat on the old narrow bed and tried to relax. I ate a quick meal out of a small container and drank some water. Then I tried to stretch out on the bed to rest. That was when the feeling began to change. It started as something small, just a faint sense that I was being watched, but from no clear direction. I ignored it at first. I told myself it was the way the forest worked, the way silence made my thoughts take strange shapes. I had been tired for weeks, burned out, stretched thin. This was probably just another sign of it. But it didn't stop. It grew slowly over time, getting heavier as the sky outside darkened. The cabin had no lights except the flashlight I brought, so the entire interior turned dim until it was hard to see anything clearly. I could hear the wind outside and the occasional crack of a branch snapping somewhere deeper in the forest. Each sound made the hair on my arms stand up. The cabin was small, but for some reason it felt like the space around me was larger than what the walls suggested, like the dark corners were stretching further out than they should. I walked around the cabin again, checking the windows and the door. The lock felt loose at first, but after pushing it a few times, it held. I tried to calm myself by focusing on the small things: my breathing, the feel of the floor, the cold air on my skin. But the feeling kept returning, creeping into my mind each time I slowed down. When it was completely dark, the noises outside changed again. The wind sounded deeper, heavier. Something moved through the leaves in a slow, dragging way, not like an animal running or hopping, but like something large brushing through the undergrowth. I froze, standing near the bed, listening. It moved again, slow, steady, like weight shifting across the forest floor. There was no rhythm to it, no pattern, no typical animal sound. It was just movement going from one point to another, stopping for long moments before continuing. My stomach tightened. Something about the movement felt wrong. Not supernatural, just wrong in the sense that it was not a movement I could match to anything familiar. I turned off my flashlight to make myself less visible through the windows. The cabin became almost pitch black except for the faint moonlight leaking in through the open window cracks. I stood still and listened, my ears strained to catch anything. The sound stopped. Then, after what felt like a full minute, it appeared again, closer this time. I could hear the dry leaves shifting under weight, not snapped violently but pressed down slowly, almost carefully. The movement circled around the clearing, never getting too close but also never leaving. It was like something was lingering at the edges, pacing. I felt trapped, even though the cabin technically had a door I could walk out of. The dark forest outside felt even more threatening than staying inside. I tried to calm myself again, telling myself it could be a deer, or maybe the wind making something heavy sway, maybe even a fallen branch being pushed around. But my mind didn't buy any of it. The pacing had too much intention in it, too much patience. Time passed slowly. I had no way of knowing how long I stood there, listening, barely breathing. Then, at some point, the pacing stopped completely. The sudden silence felt worse than the movement. At least when I heard it, I could track it. But when it went quiet, the entire forest blended into one thick blanket of darkness and soundless air. I kept standing still for a long time until my legs began to ache. I slowly moved back toward the bed and sat down, keeping my flashlight close but turned off. The cold from the window crawled deeper into the room, making the air feel even heavier. I lay back on the mattress, but every approach of sleep was broken by some small noise. Another crack, rustling, the house shifting again, or my own heartbeat pounding too loudly. Eventually, I must have slept for a few minutes, because the next thing I noticed was the sound of something snapping sharply in the distance. It was loud enough to pull me out of my half-sleep. My eyes opened instantly. My entire body felt stiff and alert, like I had been running in a dream and woke still gasping. The snapping sound came again, but softer this time. Then I heard something brushing lightly against the cabin's outer wall. My mouth went dry. The sound was slow, dragging, like fingertips or something soft, moving across old wood. Then it stopped. I held my breath. The cold air from the window moved across my face. I kept staring at the dark ceiling, refusing to move. Then I heard it again, this time at the window. A soft drag across the outside of the wood frame. Then something pressed lightly against the glass. Not enough to move it, but enough to make a dull tap, just barely audible. I forced myself to stay still, even though every instinct told me to grab the flashlight and shine it out the window. Something told me that I did not want to see what was out there. Not because it was supernatural, but because seeing a real person standing outside would be far worse. A stranger in the middle of nowhere, pacing around the cabin in the dark, dragging their hand along the walls, tapping the window. It was the kind of thing that was real, dangerous, and impossible to predict. The tapping stopped, replaced by nothing but silence. I waited. My breathing stayed shallow and slow, as quiet as I could make it. I knew that if whoever or whatever was out there wanted to hear signs of life inside, breathing would be the easiest giveaway. The silence stretched on for so long that eventually I started to doubt myself. Maybe it had been a branch hitting the glass. Maybe a raccoon brushed up against the wall. Maybe the forest was just playing tricks on my senses. But even as I tried to convince myself of that, something in me knew better. That slow, dragging sound across the wall had been too deliberate. When the sky finally began to lighten, to that dim, cold blue that appears before sunrise, I felt the tension inside the cabin begin to lift just enough for me to move again. The light felt like a shield, thin but still protective. I grabbed the flashlight and slowly approached the nearest window. I didn't open it. I just looked out through the narrow crack where the frame didn't fully align. The clearing looked empty. The trees stood still. There were no signs of movement. The ground near the cabin looked the same as the night before. But then I saw something that made my stomach tighten again. Near the edge of the clearing, close to where the trees started, the ground looked disturbed, as if something heavy had stood there for a long time, pressing down into the leaves and soil, leaving a subtle but noticeable patch of flattened ground. I stepped back from the window. I felt a deep sense of unease flood through me again. I knew I couldn't stay. The daylight was coming fast, but I didn't want to risk another night. I packed everything within minutes, my hands slightly shaking. I checked the door carefully before opening it, scanning the clearing again. Nothing moved. The forest felt strangely calm, almost innocent in the daylight. It was hard to believe what had happened during the night, or what I thought had happened. The cabin looked normal. The trees looked normal, but the flattened patch near the trees stayed in my mind. I locked the cabin from the outside and stepped down onto the clearing. The ground felt cold and slightly damp under my shoes. I walked quickly toward the path that led back to where I parked my car. The forest around me was quiet except for birds that had started their morning calls. The air felt different now, less heavy, but still tense in a way that made my skin crawl. Halfway down the path, I saw something else. A single fresh footprint pressed into the muddy edge of the trail. It was not an animal print. It was unmistakably a human footprint, barefoot, large, and deep enough to show the full shape. It was pointed toward the direction of the cabin. I stopped for a moment, staring at it. The forest around me stayed silent. I felt my heart pounding harder than it had all night. Someone had been there. Someone who walked barefoot through the forest in the middle of the night, pacing around the cabin, dragging their hand along the walls, pressing against the window, and standing out in the clearing for who knows how long. My breathing grew quick and sharp as I walked faster, almost jogging. My mind replayed all the sounds from the night, matching them to the footprint. When I reached the spot where my car was parked, I got inside as fast as I could and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. I kept looking at the narrow trail in front of the car, half expecting to see someone step out from behind a tree. The drive out was rough because of the uneven road, but I didn't slow down. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached a paved road again. Only then did I take a deep breath, the first real one since the night started. The whole experience felt unreal, but the footprint kept it grounded. When I finally got home hours later, I sat in my car for a long time before going inside. My mind kept returning to the dragging sound along the cabin wall, the slow movement in the forest, the quiet tapping on the window, the flattened patch of ground near the trees, and the footprint on the trail. None of it pointed to an animal or the wind. It pointed to a real person walking around the cabin in the middle of the night. Someone who chose not to come closer. Someone who stayed just at the edge of the clearing, waiting, watching. In the end, the strange thing wasn't that someone was out there. It was that they didn't try to break in, didn't try to speak, didn't run away when morning came. They simply paced around the cabin, dragged their hand along the wood, tapped the window, and then left a single footprint facing the direction of the cabin. The ending became clear to me only after I thought about it many times. Whoever it was knew the cabin was rarely used. They probably watched it often. Maybe they lived somewhere deep in the forest. Maybe they were hiding from something, or maybe they were simply waiting for the right moment. Whatever the reason, I was not supposed to be there that night. I had walked into a place that someone else had already claimed in their own silent and unsettling way. I never went back to that cabin. I never asked my coworker about the place again. I never wanted to know who might still be pacing through that forest at night, dragging their hand across the walls of an empty cabin, waiting for movement inside. And every time I think about it, I always return to one single detail. The footprint was fresh, deep, and pointed toward the cabin, not away from it. That meant they hadn't been leaving. They had been approaching. I had been planning this solo trip for weeks, imagining a break from the constant hum of the city, the traffic, the noise, and the people who seemed to swarm every street like ants. The thought of being completely alone in the woods was intoxicating, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes every small sound startlingly clear. I didn't want a cabin with electricity or Wi-Fi. I wanted a real, isolated spot where I could live with just the essentials, the kind of place where survival relied on preparation and instinct rather than convenience. The map I found online led to a small, run-down cabin deep in the forest, far from any road that saw regular traffic, a place where I'd likely see no one for days. The drive there was long, winding through narrow roads that seemed to have been forgotten by the state for decades. Trees pressed in on either side of the car, their branches scraping the sides in ways that made me wince every few miles. By the time I parked at the end of the last dirt road, the sun was already low, filtering through the dense canopy in streaks of orange and gold. I grabbed my bag, double-checked the supplies, and started the hike to the cabin. The air was crisp, smelling of pine and damp earth, carrying a chill that cut through my jacket. Every step on the uneven trail made a small crunch, leaves and twigs breaking underfoot. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked smaller than it had appeared in pictures. Its wooden frame was weathered, gray from years of exposure, the roof sagging slightly in the middle. A thin chimney leaned crookedly, suggesting that the fireplace might still work if I cleaned it out. The windows were dusty, some with cracked panes, but the door was intact. The first thing I did was check the perimeter, making sure there were no obvious signs of wild animals or people squatting inside. Satisfied, I pushed the door open. The smell hit me first. Old wood, dampness, and something faintly metallic, almost like rust. Inside, the cabin was small, just a single room with a loft above. There was a wooden table with one creaking chair, a fireplace, and a small pile of firewood in the corner. The loft had a simple mattress covered in a threadbare blanket. I set down my bag, relieved to finally be there, though a strange unease settled in the pit of my stomach. The first night was mostly uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest around me was watching. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves seemed amplified in the stillness. I had brought a lantern, so I set it near the table, casting a circle of dim light across the cabin. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the roof and shaking the trees. I told myself it was normal, that the forest had its own rhythms, and I had nothing to fear. But even as I lay on the loft mattress, the sounds made me tense. My imagination ran wild, inventing footsteps and whispers where there were none. I finally slept in short bursts, waking to the faintest sounds, my ears straining in the dark. The next day, I explored the surrounding area. The forest was dense, the trees towering and close together. I found a small stream not far from the cabin and followed it for a while, noting a few spots where I could collect water safely. I marked a path back to the cabin with small pieces of bark and branches so I wouldn't get lost. Everything seemed calm, peaceful even, though the isolation pressed heavily on me. By evening, I had collected firewood, gathered water, and even set a small trap for fish in the stream, feeling a sense of accomplishment. That night, I felt a little more secure, the unfamiliarity of the cabin fading slightly into a form of comfort. The second night, however, brought a new set of problems. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to the sound of something scraping against the outside of the cabin. My heart froze, and I stayed perfectly still, listening. The sound was deliberate, slow, like claws against wood, intermittent and echoing. I sat up, trying to rationalize it. It could have been a deer, a raccoon, or even a bear, though the pattern didn't feel random enough for an animal. My mind raced. I had no way to call for help. My phone had no signal beyond the edge of the forest, and I was alone. The scraping continued for several minutes, sometimes closer, sometimes further, until it finally stopped. I didn't sleep again that night, keeping the lantern lit and clutching a small hatchet I had brought. Over the next day, I stayed mostly inside, avoiding the forest unless necessary. I reinforced the door with an old plank I found leaning against the cabin, blocking the bottom half where the wood had begun to rot. I moved the table near the door to add another barrier. Every small noise made me jump. The wind, the creaking floorboards, the occasional snap of a twig outside. I realized that I wasn't just dealing with fear of animals or the elements. My mind was beginning to warp under isolation, every sound magnified into a potential threat. On the third night, things escalated. Around midnight, I heard it again, but this time it wasn't just scraping. There were footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. I held my breath, frozen, trying to tell myself it was my imagination, but the rhythm was too precise, too human. I remembered the small axe in my bag and slowly retrieved it, holding it like a lifeline. The footsteps stopped at one side of the cabin, and I heard a faint tapping on the window. My stomach turned over, and for the first time, I truly understood the vulnerability of my situation. I considered fleeing into the forest, but it was dark, and I knew I'd never make it to the main road without being seen. I had to wait. Hours passed, each one stretching into what felt like an eternity. The sounds eventually stopped, and I stayed alert until dawn, my mind exhausted. When the light came, I cautiously looked outside. There were footprints in the mud near the cabin, large, booted prints that weren't mine. They circled around but didn't come close enough to show signs of breaking in. I took photos with my phone and documented the direction they came from. My heart sank when I realized they came from the main trail, meaning someone had been following me, aware of my presence in the cabin. The following days were a tense blur. I reinforced windows, made traps and alarms with cans and string, and only ventured out when absolutely necessary. I started keeping a detailed log, noting every sound, every change in weather, and every sign of human activity around the cabin. Each night became a game of endurance, forcing myself to stay awake, listen, and survive. By the fourth night, I felt the strain of fear taking its toll. My body ached, my mind raced constantly, and I realized the real danger wasn't the forest. It was the knowledge that someone knew exactly where I was and could strike if they wanted to. Then it happened. On the fifth night, I was resting when I heard a different sound. This time, it wasn't outside. It was inside the cabin. The small loft mattress creaked as if someone had stepped on it. My blood ran cold. I gripped the axe, moving slowly to the top of the ladder, scanning the floor below. Nothing was there, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. Someone had managed to get inside, quiet as a shadow. I searched every corner, but there were no signs of forced entry besides a small window slightly ajar, where I hadn't secured the latch properly. I spent the rest of the night in a state of hypervigilance. When dawn broke, I inspected the cabin. Everything seemed untouched except the window. That's when I made the decision. I couldn't stay. This was no longer an adventure. It was a risk I couldn't mitigate. I packed quickly, taking only the essentials, and left in the early morning light, avoiding the main trail as much as possible. I moved through the forest, using the stream as a guide, until I reached a secondary dirt road about 2 hours later. From there, I flagged down a passing car, grateful beyond words. Once I reached safety, I reported the incident to the authorities, providing photos of the footprints and the cabin. They found evidence that someone had been living nearby in a makeshift shelter, observing the cabin for days, though they never caught the person. The experience stayed with me, a vivid reminder of how fragile isolation can make you, and how quickly peace can turn into fear when someone else knows exactly where you are. Even weeks later, I replayed every sound, every movement, every shadow from that cabin in my mind. The forest itself had been harmless, but the presence of another human, patient, calculating, and unseen, had turned an adventure into a nightmare. I realized then that survival isn't just about preparedness or strength. It's about recognizing danger in every form, and sometimes the only way to survive is to leave, no matter how much you think you can handle it. I never returned to that cabin, and I never planned to. I had been planning this trip for months, a solo escape from everything. My life had been moving too fast: work, bills, people, noise. I wanted silence, the kind that wraps around you and forces you to hear your own thoughts. I found a cabin listed online, deep in the forest, far from roads, far from people. The pictures showed a small wooden structure with a stone chimney, a small porch, and a thin trail leading into the trees. It looked isolated, but in a good way. I booked it immediately, craving the emptiness. The drive there was long. My car rattled over uneven gravel roads, and the forest grew denser with every mile. The trees were tall and thick, their branches forming shadows that moved like dark water over the path. Birds flew overhead in sudden flocks, startled by my engine. The further I went, the quieter everything became. By the time I reached the small clearing where the cabin stood, the sun was low, casting long golden slashes across the forest floor. The cabin was exactly as advertised, small, wooden, and weathered, with peeling paint and a sagging roof. I parked, shut off the engine, and felt the first real silence I had experienced in years. I approached the cabin, noticing the details that pictures couldn't capture. The wood was rough under my fingers, warped slightly by years of rain and sun. The porch creaked with every step, a subtle warning that it hadn't been cared for in a long time. The door opened easily, but it was stiff, scraping along the frame. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and earth, a faint, musty odor that spoke of years of emptiness. Dust coated the furniture in thin layers, and cobwebs clung to corners where sunlight couldn't reach. It felt abandoned, but not completely. There were signs someone had been there recently. A half-empty jar of peanut butter in the small kitchen, footprints in the dust near the back door, but it was clear I would be alone for now. I set down my bag, lighting a lantern I had brought with me, and moved through the cabin slowly, inspecting everything. There was a small bedroom with a mattress that looked clean enough to sleep on, a tiny bathroom with a toilet and a sink, and a living area with a wood stove and a couple of chairs. The windows were thick with grime, but I could see the forest pressing in on all sides, a wall of green and brown that stretched endlessly. I felt a strange mixture of comfort and unease. Comfort because it was exactly the quiet I wanted. Unease because the isolation was deeper than I expected. Here, there was no one to call if something went wrong. Here, I was entirely alone. The first night was peaceful in a way I hadn't known in years. I lit the stove, feeling the warmth spread through the cabin, and ate a simple meal I had brought along. Outside, the forest was alive with sounds. The rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs, the distant call of an owl. I listened until my eyes grew heavy and finally fell asleep, the lantern casting a soft glow in the corner of the room. The next morning, I woke to fog curling through the trees, so thick that the cabin seemed to float in a white sea. I walked outside to get a better view, my boots sinking slightly in the damp earth. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet, as if it were holding its breath. I walked along the narrow trail leading away from the cabin, trying to shake off a sudden, inexplicable tension. The trail twisted and turned through the trees, roots and rocks making footing tricky, and I stayed close to the cabin, reminding myself I didn't need to go far. But as I explored, I noticed signs that disturbed me. There were footprints in the soft earth, not my own and not entirely human. They were long, narrow, and deep, suggesting weight. They appeared to come from the forest edge and stopped abruptly near a fallen log. I crouched to look closer, but there was no other sign of movement. My pulse quickened, but I told myself it was probably an animal, or perhaps someone else who had rented the cabin before me. Still, I felt eyes on me, the kind of feeling that presses into your back and makes your skin crawl. I spent the day cautiously exploring the surrounding woods, collecting kindling for the stove, and checking the small creek I had seen from the porch. The water was clear and cold, flowing steadily over smooth stones. It was calming, but the further I went from the cabin, the more I felt that quiet tension return, the sense that I was being watched. I kept to well-trodden paths, moving slowly, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. By evening, I was exhausted, and I returned to the cabin, locking the doors and bolting the small latch inside. The night brought no relief. Every snapping twig, every brush of leaves in the wind, made me flinch. I stayed awake longer than I wanted, listening, telling myself it was just animals, that humans would not be here, and yet the unease would not leave me. On the third day, I decided to venture farther. I packed my small backpack with water, food, and a flashlight. The forest grew thicker, the canopy blocking much of the sunlight. I kept to a narrow, rough trail, but it soon disappeared, swallowed by undergrowth and fallen trees. I had to push branches aside and step over roots, my hands scraping bark, my boots muddy. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. The forest was no longer comforting. It was oppressive. The sounds of birds and water seemed muted, as if swallowed by the density of trees. I paused often, catching my breath and listening, but the forest remained unervingly silent. And then I heard it, a low, rhythmic sound, distant but deliberate. At first, I thought it was water or wind, but it had a pattern. It was approaching. My stomach tightened. I moved slowly, trying to see what it was, but the fog had returned, curling around the trees in thick, gray sheets. By the time I realized what the sound was, it was too late to turn back easily. The rhythmic thudding grew louder, punctuated by occasional snapping twigs. Something or someone was moving toward me. My pulse hammered in my chest, and I tried to remain calm, telling myself to stay quiet, to make no sudden movements. I crouched behind a large tree, pressing my back to the rough bark, my eyes scanning for any sign. Then I saw it, shapes moving between the trees. Not human exactly, but upright, large, and slow. Shadows that merged with the fog, yet unmistakably deliberate. My mind raced. I had prepared for isolation, but not for this. Not for being watched, stalked by something unknown in a forest that had suddenly turned hostile. I retraced my steps as quietly as I could, taking care not to snap branches or disturb leaves. But every turn I made seemed to lead deeper into the forest. The path I had followed was gone, erased by fog and undergrowth. Panic began to rise. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I felt my hands shaking as I gripped the flashlight, shining it around. The shapes had stopped moving, but the sound of heavy breathing, or was it just the wind, was close enough to make me flinch. I knew I had to get back to the cabin. I tried to remember landmarks, the small creek, a fallen tree I had passed, but everything looked the same, twisted and surreal in the fog. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time lost meaning. The forest became a maze, and every step seemed to bring me no closer to safety. At one point, I slipped in mud, falling hard on my side. My backpack tumbled, scattering its contents, and the flashlight rolled away, its beam cutting a thin line through the gray. My chest heaved, pain lancing through my side, but I scrambled to retrieve the light. And then I saw the cabin, a faint silhouette through the fog. Relief washed over me, sharp and immediate. I ran, stumbling, cutting myself on branches, slipping in mud, but I ran. The shapes in the forest did not follow, or at least I never saw them again. Maybe they had been animals, maybe humans, but I did not stop to think. Only the cabin, only safety. When I reached the cabin, I slammed the door shut, bolted it, and collapsed on the floor. My hands were cut and bleeding, my clothes torn and muddy. I lit the stove and sat in the glow, shivering, exhausted, and tense. I stayed awake that night, listening to the forest, but nothing came close again. I knew I would not venture far again. The isolation I had wanted had turned into terror, a reminder that the forest was not forgiving, and that solitude could be dangerous in ways I had not imagined. The next morning, I packed my essentials, leaving most of my belongings behind. I had a car now and a long drive ahead, but I felt a strange sense of relief. I had survived, and the memory of being alone in the dense fog, hunted by something unseen, would stay with me forever. I did not regret the trip because it had reminded me of how small I was in the world, how fragile solitude could be, and how precious life was when faced with the raw, indifferent wilderness. I left the cabin standing alone in the forest, its walls silent witnesses to the fear I had felt, and I drove away, the forest receding behind me, leaving only memories, scars, and the lesson that isolation can be beautiful, but it can also be terrifying in ways you cannot fully prepare for. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. I had a week off from work and a craving for absolute silence and isolation, somewhere far from any city lights or traffic noise. I found a small cabin online, listed as secluded and rustic, tucked deep in the mountains of the northern forests. The pictures were modest but inviting, surrounded by tall pines and thick underbrush. It had no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and only a small wood stove for heat. Sounded perfect. I had packed my car with supplies carefully. Enough food for a week, water, camping gear just in case, batteries, flashlights, and even an emergency first aid kit. I liked being prepared. I liked to feel in control. The drive there was longer than I expected. The main highway faded into winding back roads, narrow and full of sharp turns, flanked by dense trees that seemed to press close to the asphalt. The deeper I drove, the more isolated it felt. The air smelled different, sharper, cleaner, and there was a stillness to the forest that felt almost unnatural. Occasionally, I passed a few signs of other houses, but they were sparse, worn, and scattered. No one was outside, no lights were on. Even the occasional power lines disappeared, leaving just trees and shadows. When I finally arrived, the sun was dipping behind the peaks. The cabin looked smaller in person, but sturdier than it appeared online. It had a small porch with a wooden railing that creaked slightly under my weight, and the windows reflected the last golden rays of the day. I parked the car near the edge of the clearing, grabbed my bags, and walked up the steps. The door opened easily, and a faint smell of wood and dust greeted me. The inside was simple. One main room with a small kitchen area, a table, a few chairs, and a wood-burning stove. There was a loft above with a mattress, and a small bathroom with a shower and a cold water sink. The place was clean, though clearly unused for a while. I liked that. Felt like it had been waiting for someone to arrive. I unpacked, set up my sleeping area, and started a fire in the stove. The flames licked the walls of the small room, filling it with warmth and a comforting glow. I made a simple dinner, canned beans and a protein bar, and sat on a chair near the fire. Outside, the sky was fading to a deep, dark blue. Stars began to appear, one by one, until the sky was a blanket of them. The forest around the cabin was silent except for the occasional rustle of branches. I felt calm. This is what I had come for. Isolation, peace, quiet. As night fell, I did my routine check. I made sure the doors were locked, the windows closed, and all my flashlights were within reach. I had brought a small hand axe and a hatchet, just in case I needed to chop more wood, and I kept them close to the stove. I also carried a knife in my backpack at all times. The woods can be unpredictable, I told myself. The wind picked up, brushing against the sides of the cabin, and the shadows outside shifted with the moonlight. The occasional animal call echoed through the trees, an owl, maybe, or a coyote. I lay down on the mattress, listening. My mind was clear, calm, and content. That was until I heard it. A sound. Soft, almost like footsteps. I froze. My first thought was that it was outside, somewhere in the forest. The cabin floor creaked slightly under my weight, and I strained to hear. Another sound. There it was again, deliberate, rhythmic, slow. Not a deer, not a raccoon. Footsteps, large, heavy, deliberate, coming closer to the cabin. My stomach tightened. I told myself it could be a neighbor, though the odds of anyone wandering here at night were slim. Still, the sound persisted, circling the cabin. I reached for the flashlight on the bedside table and held it tightly, shining it toward the window. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the clearing, but no one was there, just trees swaying in the wind. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a bear walking upright, though that seemed impossible. My hands were shaking slightly. I had never been this far alone in the woods before. The footsteps stopped. Silence fell. My pulse raced, and I realized I could hear my own breathing. I grabbed the hatchet from where I had left it and held it by the stove, listening intently. Then, a new sound, a low scraping against the cabin wall. Not the roof, not the windows, but the wall. Something was moving along the exterior of the building, pressing against the wood. I stayed still, barely daring to breathe. The scraping continued slowly, methodically, as though someone or something was checking every surface. My mind ran through every scenario. A person? A drunk hiker? An animal? I had left no food outside, so why would an animal make this noise here? And yet, I could not shake the sound. It was patient, deliberate. I considered going outside, but I knew that would be a mistake. The darkness, the isolation, it was dangerous. I needed to wait, stay calm, and keep the fire going. Hours passed. I dozed intermittently, waking every time I thought I heard something. The footsteps seemed to return, sometimes near the front, sometimes behind. I kept all the doors locked, the windows latched, the flashlight in reach. At some point, I heard a low knock, not loud, just a single tap against the door. I did not answer, did not move, just froze. The knocking repeated, slow, deliberate, spaced out. My heart pounded. I gripped the hatchet harder, continued for a while, then stopped. Then silence. Morning came slowly, light creeping over the treetops, turning the forest from black to deep green and brown. I was exhausted, my body tense, my eyes raw from staring into the dark all night. I forced myself to eat a little breakfast, checking every window and door. Nothing. No footprints in the dirt. No sign that anyone had been near the cabin. The forest was calm, quiet, just as it had been when I arrived. I told myself it was my imagination, a side effect of isolation, a mix of adrenaline and fear. Perhaps it had been an animal, perhaps just shadows and wind. I tried to push the memory away. The next few days were tense. Every sound outside made me alert. Every shadow made me uneasy. I chopped firewood during the day, filled the stove at night, and kept everything in order. I also kept a small journal, writing down every sound, every thought, every strange moment. On the third night, I was lying in the loft when I heard it again. The footsteps, slower this time, more careful, closer. Then a whisper of movement near the porch. I grabbed the flashlight and hatchet and slowly descended the ladder to the main room. The front door was locked, windows closed, yet I could hear a scraping against the wood. Something was persistent. I stayed awake the entire night after that, constantly shining the flashlight into the dark, listening for the slightest movement. My nerves were raw, my body tense, my mind exhausted. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, set me on edge. I realized that no matter how rational I tried to be, something out there wanted me to feel fear. That night, I made a plan. I decided that if whatever was outside tried to get in again, I would leave immediately. I packed a small bag with essentials, water, food, my knife, and some matches. I would drive down the mountain back to civilization. I would not risk staying. Sleep was impossible, so I waited, sitting in the chair by the fire with the hatchet in my hands. Hours passed. I dozed lightly. Morning came. When I stepped outside into the cold dawn, I noticed tracks in the dirt. Large, booted footprints, circling the cabin, disappearing into the forest. Not animal tracks. Human. Someone had been there all along, sneaking around the cabin while I slept, checking the windows, testing the locks. I felt the weight of every night I had spent in terror, realizing I had been alone in the cabin with someone watching me. My heart pounded as I loaded the car, checked the locks one final time, and drove away, keeping the engine running until I was back on the main road. When I returned to the city, I reported the incident to the local authorities. They told me that occasionally, Secluded cabins like that attract intruders who enjoy watching people. No one was ever caught in that area, but it was not unheard of. The thought of someone deliberately hiding near my cabin, watching me every night, sending me into that panic, was chilling. I avoided the mountains for years after that. Looking back, I realized that the fear I felt was completely justified. The isolation, the lack of help, the persistent footsteps. Every detail was real, tangible. No imagination, no ghost stories, just the raw, frightening reality of being vulnerable and alone in the woods. That cabin, which had seemed like paradise, became a lesson in caution, awareness, and respect for the unknown dangers that exist in even the quietest, most peaceful places. Eventually, I returned to the mountains, but never to that cabin. I learned to always check the area before staying somewhere isolated, to trust my instincts, and to understand that fear is sometimes the most rational response to real danger. The woods are beautiful, silent, and still, but they are also full of shadows, full of people who will take advantage of the solitude. I never felt the same sense of peace in the mountains again, but I also survived, and in the end, I understood what true isolation really meant, and how carefully one must tread within it. I had been planning the cabin trip for months. After the chaos of work, the city, and constant noise, I needed somewhere isolated, somewhere I could be alone with my thoughts and nature. The cabin was tucked away deep in the woods of northern Vermont, far from the nearest road, tucked between two small ridges and a creek that cut through the forest like a silver snake. The pictures online made it look cozy, almost perfect. A wooden structure, small but solid, with a chimney and a porch that looked out over a clearing surrounded by thick trees. I didn't want company. I didn't even want the faint hum of a car engine or the flicker of a neighbor's television. Just me, the forest, and the quiet. I drove in the late afternoon. The route was long, winding, and poorly marked, and the forest seemed to close in around the narrow asphalt road, casting shadows that were long and twisted even in daylight. My GPS kept recalculating, acting like it wasn't sure where I was, but I had printed directions as a backup. When I finally saw the clearing, I pulled the car onto a thin strip of grass near the cabin and killed the engine. The air was heavy, smelling of pine and damp earth, and the wind whispered through the treetops in a sound that felt almost alive. I took a deep breath and stepped out. The quiet hit me immediately, pressing against my ears, different from city quiet. Here, quiet had weight. It was a physical thing, pressing against me, making my own heartbeat feel loud. The cabin itself was older than I expected. The wood was weathered, gray in spots, and the paint on the door was peeling. There was a small stack of firewood to one side, neatly piled, though some of it looked damp. The chimney had a thin layer of soot, meaning someone had used it recently, maybe weeks ago, but the cabin smelled like it hadn't seen human life in months. I unpacked slowly, taking my time, not just with the physical act of moving bags from the car, but with taking in the space. The living room was small, with a single sofa pushed against the far wall, a wooden table in the center, and a stone fireplace. The kitchen was minimal: sink, counter, a few cabinets. I checked the small bedroom, where a bed with a thin mattress sat beneath a window facing the forest. It was just enough for me. The first night was quiet, as expected, but also unsettling in a way I hadn't anticipated. The forest sounds were subtle but constant. The creak of trees, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig far off. I tried to sleep, but my mind kept turning over the forest's noises. Around 2 in the morning, a sound broke through my half-sleep. It wasn't an animal, at least not one I recognized. Something moved near the cabin, in the dark, slow and deliberate. My eyes snapped open. I could hear it clearly. The soft crunch of leaves, the faint scraping of branches against wood. My body tensed. My first instinct was to dismiss it, tell myself it was probably a deer or some small animal, maybe a raccoon climbing the logs. But there was a pause in the movement, a hesitation that didn't fit the patterns of normal animals. It was deliberate, patient, almost like someone was circling, waiting. I got out of bed quietly and grabbed the flashlight I had brought, turning it on and sweeping it over the clearing. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the edge of the tree line, but nothing moved. Still, my stomach tightened, and I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. I double-checked the doors and windows. They were all latched, though I noticed some of the old locks were rusty, easy to force. The thought was fleeting and horrifying, but I forced myself back into bed. Sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by the same feeling of being watched. The next day, I tried to normalize the fear. I chopped some firewood, cleared leaves around the porch, and explored the nearby creek. The forest was beautiful in the morning light, but even then, I couldn't ignore the subtle unease. Every rustle, every crack of wood made me pause. I felt eyes on me constantly. That evening, I built a fire in the fireplace and sat close, trying to calm my nerves with warmth. But as darkness fell, the feeling returned, stronger, more pressing. Something was moving near the cabin again. This time, I heard footsteps on the back porch. My heart jumped into my throat. I grabbed a heavy log from the fire, holding it as a makeshift weapon, and waited. The steps stopped. Then there was a pause. Then a scraping sound, soft but unmistakable, as if something was trying to test the door handles. My mind raced. Could it be an animal? Could it be a human? The possibility of a person lurking in the woods, waiting for me, made the fear tangible, like a physical weight on my chest. I couldn't stay inside and just hope it was nothing. I needed to see. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped cautiously onto the porch. The light sliced through the darkness. I checked the perimeter. Nothing. The forest seemed still, almost too still. I circled the cabin, shining the light into every shadow. Then I noticed tracks. Barely visible, faint impressions in the damp soil, leading from the tree line to the back porch. Human tracks. My stomach dropped. Someone had been here. Someone had been around my cabin. Maybe even last night. I spent the night awake, sitting near the fire, flashlight in hand. I tried to tell myself I would call someone, but there was no signal, no way to get help. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the road leading out was long, narrow, and dark. I realized, with a cold certainty, that if someone wanted to harm me, I would have very little warning. The following morning, I made a plan. I wouldn't stay inside alone. I packed my bag as if I would leave at any moment. I explored further into the woods, keeping an eye out for tracks or signs of anyone else. I found none at first, just the remnants of old animal trails and fallen branches. Still, the sense of being followed never left me. Every rustle, every shadow made me jump. By midday, I returned to the cabin to find something that made my heart stop. The front door, which I had locked tightly, was slightly ajar. Not wide open, just enough to suggest someone had tried it. I didn't see signs of forced entry, which meant whoever had been here was careful, deliberate, and cautious. My hands trembled as I shut the door and bolted it as best as I could. The fire was out. The cabin suddenly felt small and fragile, like it could be breached at any moment. I spent the next few days in a heightened state of awareness. I set traps around the cabin, sticks and stones to make noise if anyone approached. I made sure every window and door was secured. I rationed food, water, and supplies, preparing as if I would have to survive on my own for an extended period. Nights were the worst. Every sound made me flinch. Every shadow seemed to stretch and move toward me. Once, I thought I saw movement just beyond the tree-line. A figure, tall, hunched, moving slowly, but when I shone the flashlight, nothing was there. My mind screamed at me to leave, to get out of the cabin and back to civilization. But the thought of moving in the dark with someone possibly watching every step made me freeze. The real terror came when I realized I couldn't tell if I was imagining things. Days blurred together. I was exhausted, my body tense constantly. I couldn't sleep for more than a few hours at a time. Food became secondary. Survival became mental, keeping myself sharp enough to notice real danger versus imagined danger. I started keeping a notebook, writing down every sound, every shadow, every anomaly. Some nights, I would stay awake all night just watching, flashlight ready, until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. Even then, I didn't feel safe. The forest had become a cage. On the fifth night, everything escalated. I heard loud, deliberate knocks on the cabin door. Not soft, testing the wood, but hard, with intention and rhythm, as if someone wanted to send a message without revealing themselves. My heart was in my throat. I grabbed a hatchet from the kitchen counter, my only real means of defense, and positioned myself behind the door, flashlight off, listening. The knocking stopped. There was a pause, then a faint scrape like someone running their hand across the wood, and then silence. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to leave. I packed what I could carry quickly: food, water, first aid supplies, my phone, and a small knife. I left everything else behind, including most of my clothes. The forest outside was dark, but I knew the general direction to the road. I moved cautiously, stepping softly but deliberately, trying to avoid making noise while keeping my own safety in mind. Every step felt amplified. The tracks I had noticed days ago were still there, faint but present, and they seemed to follow my path. Whoever had been at the cabin might still be out there, waiting. I forced myself to keep moving. It took hours to reach the road. The darkness and isolation made it feel endless. I kept checking behind me, listening for any sound of pursuit. None came. Eventually, the faint lights of a distant house appeared. Relief washed over me. I ran toward them, waving my arms, shouting, until a neighbor opened their door. I was exhausted, trembling, and nearly incoherent as I explained that someone had been at the cabin, watching, following me. Though I didn't have proof, only tracks and experience. They called the police, who met me at the road and accompanied me back. When we reached the cabin, it was empty. There was no one there. No footprints beyond the ones I had already found. No signs of forced entry inside. No clue to who or what had been watching me. The officers took my statement seriously, though they didn't promise much. They explained that isolated cabins like this could attract people with malicious intent, people who knew how to move quietly, how to remain hidden. They couldn't find anyone, but they encouraged me to report any further incidents. I left the cabin that day, walking away with a mix of relief and lingering fear. I didn't return for weeks, and when I did, it was during the day with backup, and I stayed only long enough to retrieve the few items I had left behind. I never stayed overnight again. Looking back, I understand that the real horror wasn't supernatural. It wasn't ghosts or fairy tales. It was human. Someone had been at my cabin, and I don't know why, and I might never know. But the fear, the uncertainty, the knowledge that someone could be silently observing, planning, waiting, that was more terrifying than any storybook monster. And surviving it, keeping calm enough to get away safely, gave me a strange sense of clarity. I learned what it felt like to be truly alone and to realize that sometimes the most dangerous things are not imagined. They are real, human, and silent, and they can be anywhere, even in a quiet cabin in the woods. I had been planning the cabin trip for months. It wasn't some extravagant getaway or a luxurious retreat. It was a simple cabin tucked away in a remote area miles away from the nearest town. The kind of place you could drive to, but only if you had a four-wheel drive and nerves that could handle being completely cut off. I wanted solitude. I needed it. My life back in the city had been suffocating. A relentless cycle of work, traffic, noise, and people. I wanted silence, isolation, a place where I could breathe without someone asking for something from me. The drive there was long. The city faded behind me, replaced by the endless stretches of pine and oak forests that rolled over hills like a dark green sea. The road narrowed, asphalt turning to gravel, then to dirt, and finally to tracks barely wide enough for my truck. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low, burning orange through the trees, casting long shadows across the uneven ground. The cabin was smaller than I imagined, a single-story wooden structure with a steep roof and a stone chimney. There were no signs of life. No neighbors, no cars, no smoke rising from the chimney. Just the cabin sitting alone in a clearing, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. I parked my truck and stepped out. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, a scent that felt almost like home after months of smog and concrete. The door creaked as I opened it, revealing the interior. It was dusty, but clean enough to use. There was a small kitchen with a sink that worked, a stove, and a fridge that hummed softly. A living area with a couch, a coffee table, and a wood stove. The bedroom had a bed with a thick quilt, and the bathroom had a shower and a toilet. It wasn't much, but it was perfect for what I needed. The first night was quiet, almost unnervingly so. I had expected silence, but the kind of silence here was different. There were no distant cars, no people talking, no dogs barking. Just the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of branches. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. Somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard footsteps, but it was probably an animal. My mind tried to convince me it was nothing, but the hair on my arms stood on end. I woke early the next morning. The sunlight came in through the small window, and I could see the forest outside in bright detail. Birds were chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze. I made coffee and sat on the porch, taking it all in. It was beautiful, peaceful, safe, I thought. I spent the day exploring the surrounding woods, mapping out trails in my mind, noting landmarks, streams, and areas that might be dangerous. Everything was normal. Everything felt normal. But things started changing that night. It began with sounds. Small, almost imperceptible noises at first. Scratches at the door, the creak of the floorboards in the hall, something heavy dragging across the floor above. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe animals. I had seen raccoons and deer during the day. They could be anywhere. But then it escalated. Loud bangs, thuds against the walls, the unmistakable sound of someone, or something, walking around outside the cabin. My heart raced, and I stayed in the living room, my back to the door, watching through the windows. There was nothing out there. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the cabin was old, the wood expanding and contracting in the cold night air. Maybe I was just stressed, imagining things. But the noises continued, growing more deliberate, more calculated. I could hear footsteps circling the cabin, stopping, then starting again. The scratching at the door was now accompanied by soft knocks, gentle but insistent. My stomach sank. This was no animal. I decided to check the perimeter in the morning. I slept in the living room, lights on, a knife on the coffee table. When the sun came up, I went outside. Nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign of anyone having been there. Just the forest, silent and indifferent. I felt foolish imagining threats in the night. But when I returned inside, I noticed something I hadn't before. A small branch lying near the back door, broken as if someone had stepped on it. My chest tightened. I wasn't imagining things. Someone had been here. The next day, I stayed inside, watching the trees from the windows. I didn't want to venture out, not with the thought of someone else in the woods watching, waiting. I thought about calling someone, but there was no signal. My phone wouldn't connect to the outside world. I felt trapped, alone but not alone. That night, the noises came again, louder this time. I could hear someone trying the door handles, rattling them. I gripped the knife, waiting. My mind raced through scenarios. What if they had a gun? What if they were violent? I had no way of knowing. I thought about escaping through the back window, but it was small and I was too tall. The thought of running into the forest and being caught terrified me. The logical part of my brain told me to hide, stay quiet, and wait until they left. Hours passed. The knocks stopped. The footsteps faded. I stayed awake the whole night, tense, alert, my knife ready, my ears straining for the slightest sound. When morning came, I was exhausted, but alive. I checked outside again. Nothing. No footprints. No disturbances. I didn't understand it. Whoever or whatever had been out there, they had vanished without a trace. The following days were a mix of fear and unease. During the day, I explored cautiously, but I kept returning to the cabin, my mind always on alert. At night, I barricaded the doors and windows as best I could, sleeping with the knife by my side. The forest that had seemed so peaceful now felt threatening. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made my heart pound. On the fourth night, I decided to do something different. I couldn't keep hiding forever. I needed to see to know what I was dealing with. I gathered supplies: flashlight, knife, a crowbar I found in the corner, and a flare gun I kept from hunting trips years ago. I decided I would sit in the cabin, but if anyone tried to enter, I would be ready. The noises started later than usual that night. I was on edge, every sound amplified in my mind. Then I heard it, a soft whispering outside, almost inaudible, carried by the wind. My stomach dropped. Someone was there. I gripped my knife and moved to the window. Through the darkness, I could see movement among the trees, a shadow shifting between trunks. My pulse raced. Then it happened. The back door handle rattled violently. Someone was trying to break in. I grabbed the crowbar, ready to defend myself. The door shuddered under their weight with splintering. I swung the crowbar, hitting the door. The sound of it made them pause. I shouted, though no one could hear me, and fired the flare gun into the air. The bright flare lit up the clearing outside, and for a moment, I could see them, two figures crouched, watching the cabin. They didn't move when they saw the flare. They just stood there, staring. Then, without warning, they bolted into the forest, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When dawn came, I packed my essentials and left the cabin. I drove back down the rough dirt tracks, my eyes constantly scanning the woods for movement. The forest that had once felt like freedom now felt like a trap, like it was alive and watching me. By the time I reached the main road, I was shaking, my body tense from exhaustion and fear. I stopped at a gas station in the nearest town, finally able to use my phone. I called the local police and reported what had happened. They said they would check the area, but with the dense forest and lack of evidence, they didn't sound hopeful. I never went back to that cabin. Months later, I read in the local news that hikers had reported seeing strange figures in the woods near where the cabin was. People had reported being followed, watched, even having campsites ransacked. No one was ever caught. The forest had its secrets, and I had been lucky to leave with my life. Even now, years later, the memory of that cabin stays with me. The feeling of being watched, the sound of footsteps in the dark, the sense of someone waiting just beyond the trees. Those images never fade. I learned something important that week. Isolation is not always peaceful. Sometimes, being alone makes you more vulnerable. And sometimes, the real horror isn't what you imagine. It's what actually exists, unseen, waiting, and patient. The cabin taught me to respect the forest and the solitude it offered, but also to respect the unknown people who might inhabit it, silently hidden. I never went back, and I never will. That lesson cost me sleepless nights, a constant edge of fear, and the realization that even in the most remote places, you are never truly alone. I never thought I would end up in a place like that cabin, deep in the middle of nowhere, miles from any town or road. I had rented it for a week, looking for solitude, a break from the endless noise of the city and my own work. The listing promised isolation, a rustic experience, and a quiet retreat where I could read, write, and maybe reconnect with some forgotten part of myself. I didn't expect fear, or the kind of dread that creeps up slowly, unnoticed at first, until it feels like it's stitched into the air around you. The drive to the cabin was long, longer than I expected. My GPS stopped working a few miles from the cabin, insisting I turn down unmarked dirt paths that twisted through dense forest. The trees grew close together, their branches forming a kind of tunnel overhead, and as I drove, the sunlight dimmed under the thick canopy. The engine of my car sounded louder than it should, echoing in the enclosed space, bouncing back at me like it was being swallowed. I passed abandoned logging trails, broken fences, and sometimes nothing at all, just more trees. Eventually, I stopped trusting the signs or any small hints that I was on the right track. The map on my phone no longer made sense, the landmarks on the app were invisible in the real world, and I began to feel that strange disconnect where technology and nature stopped speaking the same language. When I finally saw the cabin, I felt relief that was almost physical. It was small, made of dark-stained wood that had weathered gray in places, with a steep roof and a single stone chimney. A thin trail of smoke curled from it, though I could see no sign of anyone inside. The cabin looked older than the listing suggested, and the windows, though clear, were clouded with streaks of rain and dirt. Around it, the land sloped gently toward a narrow stream, and the forest stretched in every direction. No other buildings were visible, no signs of life beyond the occasional bird or squirrel. I parked my car on a flattened dirt area in front of the cabin and took the first real look around me. The air was cool and smelled like wet leaves, pine, and something else, a faint metallic scent I couldn't place. The silence was overwhelming, and I felt exposed in a way I hadn't anticipated. The forest around me wasn't quiet in a pleasant way. It hummed with small, hidden movements, the rustle of animals, the snap of branches, the whisper of leaves that might have been wind or might have been something else. The sense of being watched came immediately. Inside the cabin, the space was small but livable. A single room served as kitchen, living, and sleeping area, with a loft above. The furniture was basic and functional. A table and chairs, a small couch, a few shelves with cooking utensils and canned food. There was a wood stove, and a pile of logs neatly stacked beside it. The air inside was musty, like it had been closed up for a while, but I could smell the faint scent of smoke from the chimney. I dropped my bag, unlocked the doors and windows, and began to settle in. The first night was quiet, almost too quiet. I had brought a small flashlight and a candle, though I mostly relied on the lanterns that the cabin provided. The darkness pressed against the windows, the shapes of the trees turning into looming shadows that crawled closer as night fell. I had expected the isolation to be peaceful, but the stillness of it felt heavy, oppressive, like the forest itself was pressing in to watch me. I kept the door locked, double-checked it, and tried to focus on my writing. Around midnight, I heard the first noise that made my stomach tighten. It was a scraping sound, faint, coming from the back of the cabin. At first, I thought it was a branch, perhaps knocked against the cabin by wind. I told myself that, but the sound repeated, slower, deliberate. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause. Not random, not like falling debris. I held my breath and listened. There was a faint smell that came with it, coppery, like something had been crushed. I got up, grabbed the flashlight, and moved toward the back door. The beam of light cut through the darkness outside, but there was nothing there, just the forest. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening. Every small sound, the cracking of the wood floor, the whistle of wind through the eaves, the distant rush of the stream, made me tense. By the time dawn came, I was exhausted, but I forced myself to go outside. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, shining the light into the underbrush, looking for evidence of anything that could explain the noise. I found footprints. Not animal footprints, they were human. Barefoot, small, perhaps a teenager or a woman, heading into the forest and then disappearing. My heart started to pound. I had expected solitude, not signs that someone had been nearby. The next few days, I tried to ignore it. I went out during daylight, gathered water from the stream, collected some firewood, and even began to enjoy the isolation, the quiet, the smell of the forest. But at night, the sounds returned. Scraping, soft footsteps outside the cabin, the sense that I was not alone. Sometimes I would hear heavy breathing, or the faint creak of a branch as if someone had stepped on it deliberately. It always stopped when I shined the flashlight, leaving me staring into empty darkness. I started noticing small things that didn't make sense. Items I had left in one place moved. The lid of the stove slightly ajar when I had closed it, the chair angled differently. I checked my locks obsessively, even though I knew they were secure. My sense of safety eroded with every night. I began to ration my energy during the day, sleeping in the chair instead of the loft, keeping a knife nearby, checking the windows constantly. The forest outside seemed different in the dark. Shapes I had ignored during the day became sinister. Shadows shifted as if alive. Every snapping twig made me jump. On the fourth night, it escalated. I was in the loft, trying to read, when I heard loud, deliberate knocks on the cabin door. 3, then 2, then 1. Heavy, slow, measured. I froze. The light from the lantern flickered. I could smell smoke from something burning outside, though I had not started any fire. My pulse was racing. I went to the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. Nothing. No one. The forest was silent except for the faint whisper of the stream. I opened the door slowly, holding the knife in front of me. The porch was empty. The ground was wet, and there were footprints leading away from the cabin into the forest. Barefoot, small, like the ones I had found before. I felt panic rising but forced myself to stay calm. The next day, I prepared for whatever was happening. I barricaded the cabin door with furniture, set up a perimeter of logs around the cabin, and collected more firewood. I moved quietly, never straying far from the windows. I kept my phone on, though there was no signal, and I studied the path to the nearest road, estimating how long it would take to get there if I needed to run. Every sound made me tense, every shadow a threat. I slept only in short bursts, my dreams filled with shapes moving just beyond the cabin. The fifth night was the worst. I had seen movement outside the window, fleeting, and I knew now that it was deliberate. Someone was watching me, waiting, testing me. I stayed in the loft, flashlight and knife in hand. Around midnight, I heard a branch snap close to the cabin, followed by a soft scraping noise against the door frame. I held my breath, my entire body tensed. Then I heard the voice of the wind, or maybe something else. I could hear faint breathing, the shuffle of feet over dry leaves. The figure did not make a mistake. It did not approach the cabin openly. Instead, it circled, waited, disappeared, reappeared. I realized that I had been watched all day, every day. The prints, the moved objects, the noises. They were all signs that someone had been near the cabin since I arrived. The rest of the night passed with terror. Me peeking through the windows, hearing movement, waiting, praying for daylight. When the sun finally rose, I ventured outside. I followed the trail of footprints into the forest. They led me deeper than I had ever been, weaving between trees, across small streams, over fallen logs. I was careful, moving quietly, listening for any sound of pursuit. After hours, the trail ended at a small clearing. In the center were items that had been taken from the cabin. My blanket, a lantern, some canned food, and a notebook. Everything was laid neatly, deliberately. The note inside the notebook was not written in words. It was a simple arrangement of scratches, marks, and lines, like someone had been leaving a message in their own language. The realization hit me that the intruder was not random. This had been planned, systematic, calculated. I returned to the cabin cautiously, fortified it further, and made a decision. I would not leave until I had a clear plan. Over the next day, I gathered supplies and prepared for the possibility of confrontation. I moved quietly, avoided unnecessary movement, and spent hours observing the edges of the forest. I could feel eyes on me constantly, and I had no illusions that the intruder would reveal themselves openly. The sixth night, I stayed awake entirely. I had the knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other. Around midnight, the figure appeared at the edge of the forest. Barefoot, thin, small, crouched like an animal. It watched me for a long time, then slowly vanished back into the trees. I realized that the cabin itself was my only advantage. The forest gave the intruder cover, but the cabin gave me shelter, protection, and a vantage point. I fortified the doors, checked the locks again, and waited for daylight. When the seventh day arrived, I decided it was time to leave. I packed everything, loaded the car, and left with extreme caution, keeping my eyes on the forest. As I drove the dirt paths, I could see movement among the trees, flashes of pale skin, the sense of being followed. But I kept moving, following the faint trail that led back to the main road. It was slow, exhausting, and terrifying, but eventually, I reached pavement. When I drove into the nearest town, I felt a mixture of relief and disbelief. I had survived, and yet the image of the cabin, the footprints, and that silent watcher stayed with me. Looking back now, weeks later, I realized what kept me alive. Awareness, preparation, patience, and the knowledge that panic would be more dangerous than any intruder. The cabin itself had been terrifying, not because of ghosts or fairy tales, but because of what human presence, even unseen, can do. I left everything behind, and the cabin now sits empty, waiting. I have never returned, and I will never return, but the memory of those nights, the sounds, the darkness, the feeling of being hunted, remains vivid. I understand now why people fear isolation. The mind, left alone, amplifies every sound, every shadow. But the real terror is not the mind. It is the knowledge that someone, human, deliberate, and silent, could watch, manipulate, and invade your life in a way that leaves you helpless. That fear is primal. That fear is real. And that fear is something I will never forget. I had been planning this trip for months. It was supposed to be a week of complete isolation, a chance to escape the constant noise of the city, the traffic, the endless stream of notifications, and the people always asking for something. The cabin I had rented was remote, deep in the mountains, far from any town or main road. From the pictures online, it looked perfect. Old but sturdy, wooden, surrounded by tall pines that blocked any view of the outside world. There was a small creek nearby, a fire pit, and a single dirt path leading in and out, winding through the forest in a way that seemed almost hidden. No cell signal, no Wi-Fi, no interruptions. Just me and the wilderness. The drive to the cabin took longer than I expected. The main road ended abruptly at a rickety wooden bridge, then turned into a narrow dirt path barely wide enough for my car. I passed fallen trees, dense underbrush, and the occasional animal crossing the road. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already low, casting long shadows between the trees. I parked, grabbed my backpack, and approached the cabin, feeling a mix of excitement and unease. Even though I knew it would be empty, the silence hit me immediately. No birds, no wind, nothing but the faint sound of the creek somewhere behind the trees. The cabin itself was more worn than I expected. The wooden boards creaked under my feet, the roof sagged slightly, and the windows were dusty. But it was livable. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and took stock of the interior. The main room had a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a worn sofa that looked like it had seen decades of use. There were 2 small bedrooms, each with a bed and minimal furniture. The smell of old wood mixed with faint mildew lingered in the air. I decided to unpack slowly, leaving my backpack in the corner and inspecting the cabin more thoroughly. As night fell, I started a fire in the fireplace. The wood crackled and hissed, the warmth slowly spreading through the cabin. I had brought canned food and snacks, so I heated some beans and bread over the fire and ate alone, listening to the quiet. Everything seemed peaceful. Outside, I could hear the faint rustle of the forest, maybe a deer or a fox moving through the underbrush, but nothing more. The first night passed uneventfully, but I woke several times to small noises. A branch tapping against the window, the creek rushing, and occasionally a distant sound that I couldn't identify. It was unsettling, but I told myself it was just the forest. I reminded myself that I was here for solitude, for a break, and that the isolation was part of the plan. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. I walked along the creek, observing the rocks, the moss, and the occasional fish darting in the water. The air was crisp, the sunlight filtering through the trees in soft patterns. I marked the path carefully, making mental notes of landmarks so I wouldn't get lost. It was peaceful, almost hypnotic, walking in the forest with no one else around. I returned to the cabin in the afternoon, tired but content, and spent the rest of the day chopping firewood and organizing the small kitchen. The third day brought an unexpected sense of unease. While I was collecting more firewood near the edge of the property, I noticed a footprint in the mud. It wasn't small. It looked like a man's boot, recent, pressed into the soft earth. At first, I thought maybe another hiker had passed by, but the cabin was not marked on any official trail maps, and the nearest road was miles away. The footprint didn't continue to any obvious path. It stopped abruptly near the trees. I brushed it off, telling myself it was probably an animal with a strangely shaped paw, though the shape was unmistakably human. Still, the cabin felt safe. I decided to remain vigilant but not let paranoia take over. That evening, while preparing dinner, I heard the sound of branches snapping near the cabin. First, I thought it was just the wind or a falling branch, but the sound repeated, closer this time. My heart started to race. I grabbed a flashlight and walked cautiously around the perimeter, checking for anything unusual. Nothing. No animals, no people, just the forest, silent again. I locked all doors and windows, piled extra logs near the fireplace, and tried to calm my mind. By the fourth night, the sense of isolation turned into anxiety. Every sound made me tense. The creak, the wind, the distant echo of some animal. I began keeping the axe I had brought nearby, just in case. Sleep was difficult. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone outside, watching, waiting. I reminded myself logically that no one could have reached the cabin without leaving traces on the path, but my mind refused to settle. The fifth day was the most disturbing. I woke early to find the front door slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it the night before. My heart pounded as I examined the lock and the surrounding area. Nothing had been stolen. Nothing inside the cabin disturbed except the door. I checked every window, every room. There were no footprints anywhere near the cabin this time, but the door had clearly been moved. I started questioning everything. Had I imagined locking it? Was I losing touch with reality from the isolation? The rational part of my mind insisted it was a mistake, but the gut feeling of being watched was undeniable. I decided to stay inside for the rest of the day, barricading the door and windows as best as I could. I kept the fire burning, prepared extra water, and tried to remain calm. I forced myself to stay awake, pacing the cabin, checking the locks repeatedly. Every small noise sent a jolt of fear through me. Outside, I could hear movement, faint but deliberate, as if someone was pacing around the cabin's edge. I did not sleep that night. On the sixth day, I realized I needed to leave, but the forest made it difficult. The dirt path back to the road was narrow and winding, and I wanted to avoid walking in the dark. I packed supplies, made sure the car was ready, and planned to leave at first light. But that night, the noises intensified. Footsteps, branches snapping, something moving just beyond the reach of the firelight. My rational mind screamed at me to ignore it, but my instincts told me otherwise. I spent hours watching the darkness, flashlight in hand, heart racing, trying to make sense of the shadows. By dawn, I was exhausted, but I forced myself to go outside. I grabbed my backpack and locked the cabin as securely as I could. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so. I hurried down the path, keeping my eyes on every shadow, every movement. Halfway to the main road, I noticed a figure in the distance. It wasn't clear, just a vague silhouette among the trees, but I felt a cold wave of dread. I quickened my pace, running when I could, and eventually reached the point where the dirt path met the main road. Once on the road, I felt a surge of relief. The familiar sights and sounds of civilization slowly replaced the oppressive isolation of the forest. I drove without stopping until I reached a gas station, where I called a friend and told them to meet me. The police advised me to report the cabin and the potential trespasser. I returned later with authorities. The cabin had no signs of forced entry beyond the door incident, and there were no traces of anyone staying there, but the footprints and evidence of movement around the property suggested someone had been lurking nearby, possibly watching for days. In the end, the cabin remained intact, the forest quiet, and the trail back clear. I never stayed there again. I sold the cabin rental rights and warned others. The experience stayed with me, a constant reminder that even in places designed for solitude, the world can intrude in ways you never expect. I learned to respect isolation, to prepare for unpredictability, and to trust instincts that sometimes defy logic. Most importantly, I realized that fear isn't always in your imagination. Sometimes it is the result of someone or something real, unseen, and patiently waiting. I had planned this trip for months. I wanted a break from the city, from the endless noise, the constant rush, the people everywhere. I wanted a place where I could be completely alone, where the only sound would be the wind in the trees, the occasional bird, maybe the distant splash of water from a stream. I found a cabin online, tucked deep in the mountains, far off the main roads, far from cell service, far from anything that reminded me of my everyday life. The pictures were perfect. A small wooden cabin with a stone chimney, a little porch overlooking the forest, surrounded by tall pines and firs. The owner said it was completely isolated. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed carefully. I didn't want to leave anything behind that I might need. I took enough food for several days: a small propane stove, water bottles, batteries, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and a large backpack to carry everything. I also brought a hunting knife just in case and a basic toolkit. I drove for hours, leaving the city behind. The roads became smaller, then gravel, then dirt tracks that wound between hills and dense trees. My phone lost signal hours before I even reached the area. By the time I reached the cabin, it was late afternoon, the sun dipping low behind the mountains, throwing long shadows across the forest floor. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures. Wooden, old but sturdy, with a small stack of firewood by the porch. There was a faint smell of pine and earth, fresh and clean, and I felt a brief moment of relief. I parked the car on a narrow path and carried my backpack inside. The cabin was simple. A main room with a small kitchen area, a table and 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, and a loft that served as the sleeping area. The air was cool but dry. Dust lay on the corners, but the place was clearly maintained. I set my backpack down and started unpacking, making a list in my head of things I still needed to do. Firewood, water, check the stove, and just breathe. I decided to start by chopping some firewood for the evening. The pile outside was small, and I didn't want to be caught in the dark without enough wood. I carried the axe outside and began splitting logs. The sound of the axe hitting the wood echoed through the trees, and for a moment, I felt completely alone in the world. It was peaceful, almost hypnotic, the rhythm of swinging the axe, the smell of fresh-cut wood, the cool breeze brushing my face. But then, I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt around the cabin. They were fresh. Not human shoes, not animal tracks either. They were wide, flat, and deep. I froze. They were not like anything I had seen before, and they seemed to circle the cabin, coming close to the porch and then disappearing into the trees. My first instinct was to dismiss it. Maybe some local hiker had passed by. But the tracks were too wide for a human, too deliberate to be random animal movement. I tried to shake off the feeling, but the thought lingered. I finished splitting some logs and brought them inside. I made a small fire in the stone fireplace, the flames crackling and throwing warm light across the wooden walls. I sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, listening to the forest. The sun disappeared behind the mountains, leaving only darkness outside. I had expected it, planned for it, but the forest at night was something else entirely. It was alive in a way that made you aware of how small and fragile you were. The rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig in the distance, the sudden scurry of small animals. It all felt magnified. I went to bed early, lying on the thin mattress in the loft, trying to relax. I had a flashlight within reach and the knife under my pillow, more as comfort than expectation. I fell asleep eventually, but not deeply. The forest seemed to press against the cabin walls, and I woke several times during the night to strange sounds. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind, just animals. But the sounds didn't stop. They seemed to move closer to the cabin, circling, pausing, then moving again. At one point, I thought I heard heavy breathing outside the door. I held my breath, gripping the knife, staring at the shadowy wall. After what felt like an hour, the sound faded. I finally drifted into uneasy sleep. Morning brought light and a small sense of relief. I made coffee on the stove and ate a simple breakfast. I tried to think clearly, rationally. Maybe it had been a bear or a large deer. Maybe the tracks were an old logging trail. Maybe I had just been too jumpy. I packed my small day pack and decided to explore the area around the cabin. I wanted to familiarize myself with the terrain, find water, mark paths, just get my bearings. The forest was dense, the trees close together, their trunks thick and rough, branches weaving into a roof that let only specks of light through. The ground was soft, covered in pine needles, leaves, and fallen branches. I didn't go far before I noticed signs of something unusual. The underbrush was trampled in certain areas, almost like a trail had been made, but not by humans. Branches were broken at waist height, and there were scratches on some trees. I kept moving, telling myself it was likely a bear or some large animal, but my stomach was tight, and I felt a constant pressure in my chest. I returned to the cabin before noon, deciding I needed to stay close, at least until I felt safer. That afternoon, I reinforced the cabin doors and windows. I made sure the locks worked, stacked firewood against the porch doors, and checked the windows for cracks. I filled the sink with water, just in case I had to stay inside for a while. I didn't want to leave the cabin unless absolutely necessary. The sun was lower in the sky, and shadows stretched long and dark through the trees. I kept hearing noises, footsteps, thuds, branches snapping, but when I looked outside, there was nothing. As night fell again, I felt a growing sense of dread. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I stayed by the fire, moving logs around to keep it burning strong. Every noise made me flinch. Around midnight, I thought I heard something at the back of the cabin. A low, heavy scraping against the wood. My heart raced. I grabbed the knife and flashlight and slowly approached the back door. The beam of the flashlight fell on a shadow, tall, dark, moving just at the edge of the trees. It didn't run, it didn't hide, it just watched. I froze. Then, the sound of a tree snapping made me jump, and the figure moved quickly, disappearing into the darkness. I slammed the door shut and backed away, shaking. My mind raced. I considered calling for help, but my phone had no signal. I was alone, completely, and whatever was out there knew it. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the fire, flashlight in hand, staring into the blackness beyond the windows. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I made a plan. I couldn't stay inside forever, and I couldn't stay in the cabin at night without knowing what was outside. I packed a small bag with essentials: water, food, the knife, flashlight, and first aid kit, and decided to explore more during daylight, hoping to find signs of the creature or a way out. I kept close to the cabin, following the trampled underbrush. Eventually, I saw the tracks clearly. Huge, heavy prints, almost like a human foot but much larger, and deeper than any human could make. They led away from the cabin into the thicker forest. I followed cautiously, keeping alert for any sudden movement. The tracks led me to a clearing with an old, abandoned cabin, partially collapsed, hidden by trees and brush. Inside, I found signs of recent activity: broken furniture, scraps of food, and a faint, musky smell. Whoever or whatever had made the tracks had been here before. I realized the creature was using the cabins as temporary shelter. My stomach turned. I wanted to run, but I forced myself to observe, to remember details. I noticed that the creature avoided open areas during the day, staying mostly in the dense forest. Over the next 2 days, I carefully watched, studying the movement patterns. I kept the fire strong at night, reinforced doors and windows, and made sure I had escape routes marked. I avoided leaving the cabin after dark. I even built a rudimentary alarm system, logs balanced on sticks that would fall with any movement near the doors. I learned to move quietly, to read the forest, to anticipate the sounds that were natural and those that were not. By the 4th night, I felt a mix of fear and determination. I couldn't stay trapped forever. I decided to wait until morning, then make a break for the main road. I packed my bag meticulously, hiding it behind some firewood to avoid leaving traces. I marked a trail with small pieces of bark and branches to guide me back if I had to return. I spent the night staring at the fire, listening for movement, preparing myself mentally. When the first light of dawn hit, I stepped outside. The forest was quiet. I moved quickly but carefully, following the path I had scouted earlier. The prints were still visible, but they didn't seem to be following me. I kept moving, sticking to the trees for cover, listening for any sign of the creature. Hours passed, my legs burning, my chest tight, but finally, I reached the gravel road. Relief hit me in waves. I followed the road, hoping for a car, a sign, anything. Eventually, a truck appeared, and I flagged it down. The driver looked startled but stopped. I explained my situation briefly, keeping it simple. They called the authorities, and I stayed with the driver until help arrived. When the officers came, they took me back to safety. I never saw the creature clearly, never understood fully what I had encountered, but I survived. I had learned how fragile life could be, how careful you must be when isolated, and how resourceful you could become when survival was the only goal. Weeks later, I returned to the cabin with the authorities. The tracks were gone, but the signs of recent activity remained. Whatever it was, it had moved on. I realized that fear was not just in my mind. It was real, tangible, and necessary for survival. I left the area for good, but the lessons stayed with me. Always be aware, always plan, always respect the unknown, even when it is grounded in reality, not fantasy. I never went back to the mountains, but I kept the skills I learned. I kept the awareness, the caution, the careful planning. I realized that nature was beautiful but unpredictable, and survival depended on preparation, observation, and calm under pressure. I had faced real fear, real danger, and I had come out alive. That knowledge stayed with me, a reminder that life can change in an instant, and that being ready, alert, and cautious can mean the difference between living and not. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. After weeks of constant work, moving from one assignment to another, I finally had a full week off. I wanted something quiet, something far away from cities, from people, from everything. I found a cabin listed online that was in the middle of nowhere. It was remote, not far from a small forest trail, surrounded by dense trees and a river that ran nearby. The pictures made it look perfect. Wooden walls, a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and a lofted bedroom. I didn't know the owner personally, but the reviews seemed genuine, with travelers describing peaceful stays. It was exactly what I wanted. I packed my car carefully. I made sure to bring enough food, water, batteries, and some emergency supplies. I also packed some firewood, even though the cabin was listed as having a small stock. I didn't want to rely on someone else's idea of enough. I had a map, but I didn't plan to use it much. I trusted my sense of direction, and I wanted the trip to feel like a true escape. The drive was long, the kind that slowly removes city noise from your mind. The highway narrowed into winding roads, the trees thickened, and the air got cooler as I drove further into the hills. When I finally reached the small dirt path leading to the cabin, I had to drive slowly, carefully avoiding roots and potholes. The car bounced over uneven ground, and for a moment, I wondered if I should have brought something more rugged. But I had made it, and there it was, the cabin. It was not big, but it had a certain quiet charm. Moss grew along the edges of the roof. The wood smelled faintly of pine and old varnish, and the windows reflected the thick green canopy around it. I parked, stepped out, and just stood there for a while, taking a deep breath. The first thing I did was unpack. I carried in boxes and bags, stacking them carefully, and then I checked the cabin inside. Everything seemed functional. The kitchen had a small fridge and stove. The fireplace looked clean. The furniture was simple but sturdy. The lofted bedroom held a thin mattress and blankets that smelled faintly of smoke and wood. The bathroom had an old shower with hot water, and the sink and toilet worked. It was basic, but it felt like a place I could stay for a week without feeling trapped. That first night, I lit a fire in the fireplace. I had brought some kindling, and it burned steadily, casting dancing shadows across the wooden walls. I had chosen a window that looked out toward the forest, and I sat in a chair with a book. But I didn't read much. The forest outside was quiet, almost too quiet, and every now and then I would hear a small snap from the woods. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon. Still, there was a tension in the air, something you could feel but not see. The second day, I decided to explore a little. There was a trail nearby that led into the forest. It was narrow, overgrown in places, and it twisted along the slope of a small hill. I had a backpack with water, a flashlight, and a pocket knife just in case. The air was damp from the morning dew, and the forest smelled rich and earthy. I saw birds flitting through the branches and a few squirrels racing along the trunks. For a while, it felt peaceful. But then I started to notice subtle signs that something was off. I heard a rustling in the undergrowth, closer than it should have been. I paused, looking around, but there was nothing there. A bird took flight suddenly, making a loud, sharp sound that echoed through the trees. I walked faster, my boots crunching the leaves, trying to ignore the feeling creeping over me that I was being watched. Every time I turned a corner, I felt my pulse rise, imagining shadows moving among the trees. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was already low, and I felt both relieved and foolish. I lit the fireplace again that evening, more out of a need for comfort than warmth. The shadows in the room seemed longer, stretching over the walls and ceiling. I ate a simple dinner of canned beans and bread and tried to relax, but the sound of wind through the trees kept me alert. Occasionally, I would hear something tap against the cabin, branches brushing the roof or window. I reminded myself it was normal. I was alone in the forest. Things made noise. The third day, I decided to rest. I slept late, stretched, and watched the river from a small clearing behind the cabin. The water moved quickly, and the sound was soothing. But while I was watching, I noticed tracks in the mud along the bank. They weren't human. They were too large, deep, with claw marks faintly visible in the wet soil. My stomach tightened. I had assumed there would be wildlife, of course, but seeing such large prints so close to my cabin made the danger real. I took pictures with my phone, but I avoided following them. I didn't want to provoke anything. That night, I barely slept. Every sound seemed magnified. The crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, even the river seemed louder. I stayed in the loft, lying on the mattress, staring at the ceiling. My mind tried to rationalize everything. Maybe it was a bear, maybe a large dog, maybe I was just overthinking. But the sense of being watched didn't go away. And then I heard it. A deep growl, distant but unmistakable. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. It stopped after a few seconds, but the sound lingered in my mind. The fourth day, I made a plan. I couldn't just sit inside and wait. I decided to check my surroundings carefully, to see if there were signs of animals or anything else that could be dangerous. I packed my knife and a heavy flashlight, and I walked slowly around the cabin, inspecting the ground and trees. There were more tracks, large, heavy, with deep impressions. Some led away from the cabin, some toward it. I realized that whatever was out there had been near the cabin multiple times. The thought made me uneasy, but I forced myself to keep moving and take notes. By late afternoon, I returned to the cabin. I decided I needed to make some defensive measures. I gathered extra firewood, stacked it near the doors and windows, and reinforced the doors as best I could with what was available. I knew it wasn't much, but it would buy me some time if an animal or someone else tried to enter. I also took a small amount of pepper spray I had brought for safety and kept it within reach. I felt tense but more in control. Night 4 was the hardest. Around 11 p.m., I heard a loud crash against the side of the cabin. My heart jumped, and I froze listening. Something heavy moved across the roof. The sound stopped, and then there was silence. I stayed in the loft, flashlight in hand, peering through the small window. I didn't see anything, but I could hear movement in the underbrush nearby. My instincts told me to stay quiet and wait. Hours passed. I didn't sleep at all. By the time the first light of dawn appeared, I was exhausted, jittery, and on edge. On the 5th day, I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things quickly, everything except the food I had left. I wanted to leave before anything happened. As I loaded the car, I noticed more tracks around the cabin, some of them fresh, some partially dried. Whatever had been there seemed to have spent the night close by. My stomach turned at the thought. I started the car, and as I drove off the dirt path, I kept scanning the trees, expecting to see movement. I didn't see anything. The drive back was tense. Every noise outside the car, the wind, a falling branch, an animal rustling in the forest, made me flinch. But gradually, the forest thinned, the roads widened, and the signs of civilization returned. By the time I reached the first gas station, I felt a strange relief, almost like I had escaped from something. I stopped, bought water, and called a friend to let them know I was okay. When I finally got home, I unpacked and tried to process what had happened. The week had been terrifying, but it wasn't supernatural. It was real, grounded in nature and survival instincts. The experience taught me a lot about respect. Respect for the wilderness, for its unpredictability, and for my own limits. I never returned to that cabin. Months later, I went through the photos I had taken. The tracks were unmistakable. Large, heavy, and dangerous. I realized I had been extremely lucky. The cabin was peaceful in appearance, but the forest had been full of hidden threats. That week stayed with me. I think about it often. I don't think I'll ever forget the sounds at night, the weight of the darkness, or the tension of knowing something massive and unseen was so close. But I survived, and that clarity, that sense of life preserved, became almost comforting. I learned to trust my instincts, to prepare, and to respect what I can't fully see or control. Even now, when I hike or spend time in the forest, I carry a flashlight, a knife, and pepper spray. I check my surroundings carefully. I know the forest is not kind, and it does not forgive mistakes. That cabin, the week I spent there, is a permanent reminder that survival is about awareness, preparation, and patience. And that sometimes, leaving is the smartest decision, even when curiosity tempts you to stay. Morning brought light, and with it, a small sense of relief. I had survived the night. I checked the area around the cabin and saw nothing unusual. No footprints except my own. No broken branches that weren't already there. I told myself I was imagining things, letting the isolation get to me. I spent the day fishing by a small creek I had discovered, the sound of running water grounding me. The forest seemed alive in a neutral way now, no longer oppressive, just full of life. I caught a few small fish and cleaned them at the creek, enjoying the physical work and the clear, simple task. The third night, however, was worse. I had returned from a longer hike, a little deeper into the forest, and I was tired. The sky had darkened early under thick clouds, and the wind had returned, sharper this time. When I entered the cabin, I noticed something strange immediately. The small table in the living area had been moved slightly. Not much, but enough to register. My chest tightened. I went through the cabin slowly, inspecting every corner, opening cabinets, checking the doors. Everything else was in order. Maybe I was becoming paranoid. But then I heard the scratching. Quiet at first, almost imperceptible, coming from the kitchen. Then louder. Something was moving across the floor, something heavy enough to make the wood creak. My hands shook as I grabbed the bat. I moved towards the sound slowly. Nothing. The scratching stopped. My heart raced and I stayed frozen, listening. Minutes passed. I couldn't tell if I was imagining it. Then, the sound returned, closer now, coming from the back of the cabin near the storage closet. I swung the flashlight over the room. A shadow moved. I froze, holding my breath. It was not a ghost or some fantasy creature. This was real. I could feel the weight of the night pressing in, the cold air biting at my skin. I swung the bat in front of me, took a slow step forward. Then I saw it. A man, crouched low, trying to be silent. He was dirty, his clothes tattered, and he had a wild look in his eyes. He froze when our eyes met. I had no time to think. I swung the bat and he stumbled back. He growled something unintelligible and bolted, running through the trees with a speed that made my stomach drop. I locked the doors, checked the windows, and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every noise made me flinch. Every shadow looked like him. The next morning, I called the local authorities from the cabin using my satellite phone. They told me to stay put and that a ranger would come check the area. I spent hours pacing, watching the tree lean, my senses on high alert. The ranger arrived just before nightfall, a tall man with a calm presence, and we did a full sweep of the surroundings. There were footprints, multiple sets, leading around the cabin and disappearing into the forest. I realized then that he must have been living out here, hiding, watching anyone who came near. I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear. The cabin that had promised peace had almost been a trap. After the ranger left, I spent one final day at the cabin, packing up my things carefully, checking every corner. I made sure nothing was left behind that could give anyone else the same opportunity to enter. I left the cabin locked, windows shut, and drove away slowly, eyes constantly flicking to the forest. The sun was setting, the sky a streak of orange and purple. The dirt road stretched ahead, and I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the safety of my vehicle, the isolation now behind me. I didn't look back. I knew the forest would swallow the cabin and the man who had been living there, and I didn't want to see it again. Even now, I think about that night, about how quickly everything changed from quiet solitude to something terrifying, about how close it came to being far worse. But I also think about the clarity it gave me, the way it forced me to be alert, to be aware, to respect the world and the people who inhabit it, hidden in plain sight. I carry that with me, a lesson in caution, in observation, and in the simple, fragile safety that we often take for granted. That cabin, those trees, the cold wind, they all remain vivid in my memory, and I know I will never take solitude for granted again. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. After the chaos of the city, the noise, the endless obligations, I needed isolation. The cabin I rented was deep in the forest, far from any town, and reachable only by a narrow dirt road that twisted through dense pines. I wanted silence, peace, and the kind of solitude that made it impossible for the world to intrude. The map had been clear: drive to the trailhead, park, and walk the last 2 kilometers to the cabin. Simple. I had done research, prepared supplies, and made sure I had enough food and water for the week I planned to spend alone. The drive out of town was long and slow. The roads narrowed, the pavement gave way to gravel, and then the gravel became ruts in the mud from recent rain. I kept my car slow, cautious, noticing how quiet the forest became with every mile. Birds chirped here and there, but there were no human sounds, no distant cars, no planes overhead. It was beautiful. It was everything I wanted. When I arrived at the small parking area near the trailhead, the sun was low in the sky, a pale orange slipping through the trees. I grabbed my backpack, double-checked my supplies, and started walking. The path was barely wide enough for one person. Roots jutted up, and fallen branches crunched under my boots. I passed thick ferns, moss-covered rocks, and a few small streams that trickled across the path. The forest felt alive, yet oddly still. There were no other hikers, no signs of life except the occasional bird. After about 40 minutes of walking, I saw the cabin. It was older than I expected, built from logs that had darkened over the years, but solid. A small porch stretched across the front, and the roof had a thin layer of moss. Smoke from the chimney would have been comforting, but there was none. I unlocked the door, the wood creaking as I pushed it open, and stepped inside. The interior smelled faintly of wood and damp earth. Dust had settled on the corners of the furniture, but nothing looked broken or dangerous. There was a small stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a bed tucked in a corner. I placed my backpack on the floor and began unpacking, arranging my supplies neatly. I stayed busy for the first hour, exploring every corner of the cabin, checking the windows, and stacking firewood neatly by the stove. As darkness approached, I built a fire and felt a comforting warmth spread through the cabin. The forest outside grew darker, the shapes of trees merging into black forms against the night sky. Sitting by the fire, I felt a sense of satisfaction. This was exactly what I needed: solitude, simplicity, safety. But as the first night deepened, a faint unease began to creep in. The wind rustled through the trees in ways that made the cabin groan. Shadows shifted on the walls, cast by the firelight flickering against the ceiling. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. I went to bed, the quiet enveloping me, and eventually drifted into a light sleep. I woke in the middle of the night to a sound that made my stomach tighten. It was a subtle noise, almost like a footstep, but outside. I froze, straining to hear. The wind could have caused it, branches brushing against each other, maybe an animal. I lay still for a long time, heart pounding, telling myself it was nothing. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I discovered small signs that something had been moving around the cabin. A log I had stacked neatly was knocked over. Small footprints, unlike any animal tracks I recognized, were pressed into the soft soil near the porch. My unease returned, stronger this time. I checked my supplies. Everything seemed untouched inside, but I could not shake the feeling of being watched. I spent the day trying to keep busy, gathering water from a nearby stream, collecting firewood, and exploring the small clearing around the cabin. Every sound in the forest seemed magnified. A bird taking flight, a branch snapping under its own weight, the distant rustle of leaves. I could feel my nerves fraying. As night approached again, I made sure the doors were locked, the windows secured, and I kept a large knife nearby. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. After the chaos of the city, the noise, the endless obligations, I needed isolation. The cabin I rented was deep in the forest, far from any town, and reachable only by a narrow dirt road that twisted through dense pines. I wanted silence, peace, and the kind of solitude that made it impossible for the world to intrude. The map had been clear: drive to the trailhead, park, and walk the last 2 kilometers to the cabin. Simple. I had done research, prepared supplies, and made sure I had enough food and water for the week I planned to spend alone. The drive out of town was long and slow. The roads narrowed, the pavement gave way to gravel, and then the gravel became ruts in the mud from recent rain. I kept my car slow, cautious, noticing how quiet the forest became with every mile. Birds chirped here and there, but there were no human sounds, no distant cars, no planes overhead. It was beautiful. It was everything I wanted. When I arrived at the small parking area near the trailhead, the sun was low in the sky, a pale orange slipping through the trees. I grabbed my backpack, double-checked my supplies, and started walking. The path was barely wide enough for one person. Roots jutted up, and fallen branches crunched under my boots. I passed thick ferns, moss-covered rocks, and a few small streams that trickled across the path. The forest felt alive, yet oddly still. There were no other hikers, no signs of life except the occasional bird. After about 40 minutes of walking, I saw the cabin. It was older than I expected, built from logs that had darkened over the years, but solid. A small porch stretched across the front, and the roof had a thin layer of moss. Smoke from the chimney would have been comforting, but there was none. I unlocked the door, the wood creaking as I pushed it open, and stepped inside. The interior smelled faintly of wood and damp earth. Dust had settled on the corners of the furniture, but nothing looked broken or dangerous. There was a small stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a bed tucked in a corner. I placed my backpack on the floor and began unpacking, arranging my supplies neatly. I stayed busy for the first hour, exploring every corner of the cabin, checking the windows, and stacking firewood neatly by the stove. As darkness approached, I built a fire and felt a comforting warmth spread through the cabin. The forest outside grew darker, the shapes of trees merging into black forms against the night sky. Sitting by the fire, I felt a sense of satisfaction. This was exactly what I needed: solitude, simplicity, safety. But as the first night deepened, a faint unease began to creep in. The wind rustled through the trees in ways that made the cabin groan. Shadows shifted on the walls, cast by the firelight flickering against the ceiling. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. I went to bed, the quiet enveloping me, and eventually drifted into a light sleep. I woke in the middle of the night to a sound that made my stomach tighten. It was a subtle noise, almost like a footstep, but outside. I froze, straining to hear. The wind could have caused it, branches brushing against each other, maybe an animal. I lay still for a long time, heart pounding, telling myself it was nothing. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I discovered small signs that something had been moving around the cabin. A log I had stacked neatly was knocked over. Small footprints, unlike any animal tracks I recognized, were pressed into the soft soil near the porch. My unease returned, stronger this time. I checked my supplies. Everything seemed untouched inside, but I could not shake the feeling of being watched. I spent the day trying to keep busy, gathering water from a nearby stream, collecting firewood, and exploring the small clearing around the cabin. Every sound in the forest seemed magnified. A bird taking flight, a branch snapping under its own weight, the distant rustle of leaves. I could feel my nerves fraying. As night approached again, I made sure the doors were locked, the windows secured, and I kept a large knife nearby. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. After weeks of work and endless city noise, I needed to escape. My plan was simple: rent a small cabin deep in the forest, disconnect from the world, and spend 2 days in silence, alone with my thoughts and the natural world. I found the cabin online. The pictures were modest but inviting. A small wooden structure tucked against a stand of pines, a stone fireplace in the center, and a little porch overlooking a clearing. It was the kind of place where I could imagine mornings filled with fog and evenings lit by firelight. The online description promised isolation, peace, and a trail that led to a nearby lake. That last part had sold me. I wanted nothing more than to sit beside the water and listen to it ripple, maybe fish a little, and forget about everything else. The drive up was longer than I expected. Google Maps said 2 hours from the town, but every mile the roads narrowed, twisted, and grew steeper. At first, it was just the usual country roads, lined with fields and small wooden barns. But soon, the houses thinned, and the road became more forest than pavement. Tall trees leaned over, their branches arching like tunnels over the asphalt. There were no streetlights, no traffic signs, nothing but the sound of the wind brushing through the needles and the occasional bird darting across the road. I realized I hadn't seen another car for at least 20 minutes. That should have been unnerving, but I was too excited to care. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was hanging low, casting long golden streaks through the trees. The cabin was exactly as it had been in the photos, only quieter, lonelier. I parked my car on the small dirt patch beside it and stepped out. The smell of damp pine hit me immediately, rich and earthy. I inhaled deeply, letting it fill my lungs. There was a faint chill in the air, but nothing unpleasant. It felt clean, real, alive. I carried my bag inside and set it down on the floor near the door. The cabin smelled faintly of wood and smoke. The fireplace was empty but looked like it had seen plenty of use. A small table and 2 chairs were pushed against the wall, and a narrow staircase led to a loft above. The loft looked like it had a single bed tucked into the corner, a tiny window above it letting in a thin sliver of light. The main floor had a small kitchenette with a propane stove, a sink, and a tiny fridge. It was not luxurious, but it had everything I needed. After unpacking, I decided to take a walk and explore the clearing behind the cabin. The forest seemed endless in every direction. Pine trees were tall and straight, with trunks thick enough to take 2 hands to wrap around. The forest floor was soft with needles and leaves, muffling my steps. I followed a faint trail that seemed to lead toward a small hill in the distance. It wasn't marked, but it felt natural, as if it had been used for years by hikers or animals. I reached the top of the hill just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. From there, I could see a thin ribbon of water winding through the trees far below. That had to be the lake mentioned in the listing. It was calm and dark, reflecting the fading light like glass. The sight of it made my chest tighten in a good way. I stayed there for a while, breathing in the crisp air and watching the shadows lengthen in the forest. Then I walked back, careful not to disturb the quiet too much. Back at the cabin, I started a fire in the fireplace. It took longer than I expected. The wood was dry but old, and it smoked more than it burned. Eventually, I had a small flame, enough to light the room with a warm glow. I sat on the floor near it, letting the heat seep into my legs, and unpacked the small supplies I had brought. A few canned meals, a bag of dried fruit, water, and a couple of notebooks. I planned to write a little, maybe sketch the lake, or just sit and think. As darkness fell, the forest outside the windows became almost impossibly black. The light from the fire illuminated the cabin in an orange haze, but beyond the edges of the cabin, there was nothing but shadow. I could hear small sounds, the rustle of animals in the brush, the snap of a branch somewhere in the distance, the occasional skitter of some unseen creature over leaves. Each sound felt amplified in the silence. I reminded myself that I was alone, and the quiet was exactly what I had wanted. Still, I couldn't shake a small sense of being watched, even though I knew it was unlikely. Around midnight, the noises started again, but this time they were closer. Scraping sounds against the side of the cabin, soft thumps, and the occasional low crack of wood bending. I stayed in the bed, listening, trying not to breathe too loudly. The fire had burned low, and the shadows seemed to grow taller. Something was moving just outside the wall. I told myself it had to be an animal, a deer, a raccoon, maybe a bear. But the movements were deliberate, careful, like someone or something was testing the cabin, watching me. I spent the next several nights in this heightened state, unable to sleep for more than a few hours at a time. Each morning I would find more signs of disturbance. Footprints, displaced firewood, scratches in the soft mud near the porch. I began to notice small items missing, like a can of beans or a flashlight I thought I had left by the stove. My mind kept cycling through explanations. Animals, wandering hikers, my own forgetfulness. But a part of me knew it was something else. Something human. One afternoon, I decided to explore the surrounding forest further, hoping to calm my nerves. I took a long walk along a narrow trail, noting landmarks and trying to stay calm. About 2 kilometers from the cabin, I stumbled upon a small campsite, long abandoned. A tattered tarp lay over a shallow pit fire, and old cans and bottles were scattered around. The site looked like it hadn't been used in years, but the feeling of intrusion stayed with me. Someone had been here and they might still be around. I returned to the cabin, heart heavier than before. That night, the noises were worse. There were distinct footsteps circling the cabin, pauses, then movement again. I sat in the corner with the knife clutched in my hand, heart hammering, listening. The scraping and thumping continued for hours. At one point, I heard a soft metallic sound, like someone tapping a metal object against the logs. I realized then that the intruder was trying to see if anyone was inside, testing the cabin for weaknesses. I spent the next day planning. I gathered as much wood as I could for a fire, filled containers with water, and moved my supplies into the center of the cabin, away from the windows. I made sure the doors and windows were secure. I realized that if someone tried to enter while I slept, I had no backup plan beyond the knife. The isolation that had once been appealing now felt like a trap. Over the next few nights, the intruder became more daring. Footsteps on the roof, scratches on the door, movement near the windows. I stayed awake as long as possible, lighting fires, making noise, and trying to signal presence. I avoided going outside, knowing it was too risky. Each night I listened, trying to discern patterns, trying to figure out when this person came and went. I noted the direction of tracks in the mud each morning, trying to see where they had come from. The worst night came on the 4th day. I was woken by the sound of heavy breathing just outside the door. Someone was crouched there, close enough that I could hear it distinctly. My heart nearly stopped. I remembered the small camping stove I had brought outside earlier in the day. In a moment of desperation, I grabbed it, threw it at the door, and it clattered loudly. There was a startled sound, a rustle, and then silence. I waited for hours, knife in hand, until first light. At dawn, I stepped outside cautiously. Footprints in the mud led away from the cabin, heading deeper into the forest. It was clear the intruder had fled. I checked the cabin for damage, scratches on the door, marks on the walls, but nothing major. I realized that while I was shaken, I had survived. I spent the day packing essentials, deciding to leave the cabin for good. I hiked back to my car, constantly scanning the forest. The trees that had once seemed beautiful now appeared menacing, the shadows dense and oppressive. I kept moving, never stopping, until I reached the road. Once on the paved section, I allowed myself to relax slightly. The city noise, which once irritated me, now felt like safety. I had survived, but the experience left me with a deeper understanding of isolation, vulnerability, and the dangers of being alone in the wilderness. When I returned home, I made a point of reporting the incident to the local authorities. They told me they had received reports of transient campers and people squatting in the forest, and it was likely one of them had been near my cabin. While nothing could undo the nights of fear, taking action and sharing my experience gave me some closure. I knew I had faced a real threat and had survived through careful thinking, vigilance, and a bit of luck. From that experience, I learned to respect isolation but never underestimate it. The forest had not been my enemy. The intruder had been. And while the cabin had seemed like a haven, it had also been a trap waiting for someone unprepared. That lesson stayed with me, a clear memory of fear and survival, grounded entirely in reality, without fantasy or fiction. I never returned to that cabin, but I never forgot what it felt like to face true danger alone. I parked my old, beaten-down truck on the dirt path leading to the cabin. The wheels had churned through the soft mud, leaving deep grooves, and I could hear the occasional crack of broken twigs underfoot as I climbed out. The air was sharp, cold, and carried the scent of pine and wet earth, the kind of smell that clung to your clothes and hair even hours after leaving the forest. I had planned this trip for months, a retreat from the endless noise of the city, from work emails, calls, the constant buzz of life that seemed to gnaw at me every day. The cabin had been advertised as remote, entirely off-grid, with no neighbors for miles. It promised quiet, solitude, and a chance to be completely alone. At least that was the plan. The cabin itself sat at the top of a small hill, hidden behind a dense wall of fir and spruce trees. From the outside, it looked simple, wooden, weathered, with a small stone chimney that gave a faint promise of warmth inside. The roof was slightly sagged in the middle, and the windows, dirty from neglect, reflected the surrounding forest like dark mirrors. The only sign of modernity was the solar panel leaning at a precarious angle against one side of the cabin. I had brought supplies for 3 days, intending to fish, hike, and do nothing else but be alone with my thoughts. I thought of the silence I'd get to enjoy. That was my only plan. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and a faint moldiness that made me wrinkle my nose. The floor creaked under my boots, and dust coated the surfaces. A thick layer of grime clung to the windows, muting the light that came through. I set my backpack down and pulled out a flashlight, checking the few rooms. There was a small kitchen with a propane stove and a tiny fridge, a living area with a sofa that had clearly seen better decades, a small table, and a bedroom with a single bed. The mattress looked lumpy and stained, but I decided I could manage. I unpacked my things slowly, taking care to put food in the fridge and arrange my gear neatly. I had a sense that I wanted order, some small control over the space I was entering, because I already felt the forest pressing against the walls, the silence like something alive outside the cabin. That first night, I built a fire in the small stone fireplace. I had brought dry wood and kindling, and the fire snapped to life almost immediately. The warmth was comforting, but the sounds outside were unsettling. There was the occasional rustle of branches, the wind brushing through the trees, and distant thumps that could have been falling branches or animals moving about. I had always felt a thrill in being alone, but being completely cut off amplified every tiny noise. Every groan from the cabin's wooden frame, every creak from the floor, felt louder than it should. I lay in bed that night, listening. I told myself it was just the forest, that this was normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next day, I went hiking. I had a map, a compass, and plenty of supplies, but the forest was dense. Every path looked like it twisted back on itself, and every clearing I found seemed smaller than I remembered. The sun hung high, casting thin beams through the canopy, and I kept my eyes peeled for wildlife. I saw deer tracks and the occasional squirrel, but no humans. When I returned to the cabin in the evening, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it. My stomach tightened. I stepped inside carefully, listening. Everything seemed in place. Nothing was missing. I locked the door again and checked the windows. Maybe the wind had blown it open. Maybe an animal had pushed it. My mind churned possibilities, but I tried to calm myself with logic. I had come here to be alone. Alone meant no threats. That was what I kept telling myself. But the fear had settled in, subtle and persistent. I spent the second night pacing inside the cabin, checking the locks repeatedly, staring out into the black forest. The wind had picked up, rattling the loose panels on the roof. I could hear distant branches snapping. Every sound seemed amplified in the stillness. At one point, I heard something heavier, dragging across the dirt outside. I froze. It wasn't fast like a deer or small animal. It was slow, deliberate. My mind raced. I told myself it was a fallen branch, a deer pushing against something. But the sound persisted, moving around the cabin, circling it, stopping, starting again. I grabbed the baseball bat I had brought along. I didn't want to imagine someone being out there, but the thought refused to leave me. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me into a fitful sleep on the lumpy mattress, clutching the bat even as I drifted off. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. The plan was simple. Leave the city behind, go deep into the forest, and spend a week alone in a small cabin I had rented. The cabin was remote, far enough that I wouldn't see another soul for miles. It was exactly what I needed. Time away from work, away from noise, away from everything. I packed my supplies carefully, checking and double-checking that I had enough food, water, and fuel for the stove. The backpack was heavy, but manageable, and I was eager to leave. The drive itself was uneventful. The main road wound through the outskirts of the city, past fields and small hills, then narrowed into a dirt path as I neared the forest. The last few miles were rough, my car bouncing over rocks and potholes, the dense trees on either side blocking out the sun. When I finally arrived, the cabin was exactly as described. Small, sturdy, made of weathered logs, with a metal roof and a chimney that had clearly not been used in a while. A narrow trail led from the dirt road to the cabin door, which creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was musty but clean, and sunlight filtered in through the small windows. It smelled faintly of old wood and something slightly damp. Perfect. I spent the first few hours unpacking, setting up my sleeping area, checking the stove and stacking firewood. Everything felt peaceful. The forest around the cabin was quiet except for the usual sounds of birds and insects. I had brought a few books, a notebook, and some pens, intending to write and read, but mostly I wanted to just sit and look at the forest. The first night was quiet. I made a simple dinner on the stove, ate slowly, and then sat near the window with a mug of tea, watching the dark shapes of the trees against the night sky. It was completely silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves. I went to bed early, sleeping soundly in the small bed. The second day was similar. I hiked a little along the trails nearby, marked on a map I had printed, and took notes on the plants and animals I saw. I kept the cabin in sight most of the time. Returning in the late afternoon, I noticed something strange. The small pile of firewood I had stacked neatly outside had been slightly disturbed. One piece was lying a few feet away from the rest. I paused, looking around the clearing. The forest was calm, and I could see no sign of any person or animal. I told myself it was probably just the wind, or maybe an animal knocking it over. I moved the log back into place and went inside. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every small sound, branches breaking, leaves rustling, made me tense. Around midnight, I woke to a faint sound outside, like footsteps on the dirt path. My heart started racing. I lay very still, straining my ears. The footsteps stopped suddenly. I waited for a long time, and when nothing happened, I eventually drifted back to sleep. The third day was the worst. I woke early, determined not to let the fear take hold. I made breakfast, cleaned up, and started organizing the cabin. Around mid-morning, I heard it again, the faint sound of footsteps. I froze. They were slow, deliberate, and coming from the direction of the path. I stayed silent and still, peeking through the small window. There was nothing, just the trees swaying. I stepped outside to check the perimeter. Everything looked normal. The only thing out of place was a single footprint in the dirt near the cabin steps. It was large and it was fresh. My stomach sank. I had not seen anyone else in the area, and the dirt road was miles away. I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was a hiker who had wandered off the main trail. Maybe it was someone looking for mushrooms or firewood. But the thought did not comfort me. I had chosen this cabin for its isolation, and now that isolation felt threatening. I spent the rest of the day inside, constantly watching the windows. That night I could not sleep at all. Every noise seemed amplified. The wind shaking the trees, an animal running through the underbrush, something dragging against the cabin wall. I stayed awake, sitting in the bed with my back against the wall, gripping a heavy flashlight I kept nearby. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps on the path, slow and deliberate. Then a pause, then the sound of something heavy moving over the leaves. I could not see anything through the dark windows, but I could hear it clearly. I thought about leaving, but the car was down the road, at least a 30-minute walk in the dark through thick forest. I was trapped. The fourth day, I decided to investigate. I packed some food, my flashlight, and a small hatchet for protection. I walked the perimeter carefully, inspecting the trees and the ground. I found more footprints, not far from the cabin, all leading in a rough circle around the clearing. They were the same size, heavy prints, like someone large had been pacing, watching the cabin. The thought that someone had been following me, unseen, for more than a day filled me with a cold dread. I decided to stay inside and fortify the cabin as best I could. I dragged extra logs in front of the door and windows, making them harder to open from the outside. I placed heavy objects against the main door and made a small weapon from the hatchet. I also gathered all my food into a single corner in case I needed to move quickly. By the afternoon, I was exhausted, physically and mentally. I stayed inside the cabin for the rest of the day, constantly listening. The forest, which had seemed peaceful when I arrived, now felt hostile, almost alive with invisible movement. That night, the footsteps came again. They circled the cabin slowly, deliberately. I held my flashlight against the window, and for a moment I thought I saw a shadow moving behind the trees. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. I stayed completely still, holding my breath. The footsteps paused, and then, after what felt like an eternity, they moved away. I did not sleep at all that night, and when morning came, I could barely keep my eyes open. On the fifth day, I decided I could not wait any longer. I had to leave even though the road was a long walk away. I packed everything into my backpack, making sure I had water and the flashlight. I also made a small bag with some stones and sticks, just in case I needed to defend myself. I checked the perimeter one last time. The footprints were still there, but there was no one in sight. I felt a brief sense of relief but remained tense. I left the cabin carefully, staying alert to every sound. The forest seemed quieter than before, almost unnaturally so. I stuck to the path as best I could, moving quickly but quietly. Every rustle of leaves made me stop and listen. I saw a deer jump out of the bushes, and I nearly screamed. Kept moving, my heart hammering. After what felt like hours, I finally reached my car. I checked the surrounding area thoroughly before opening the doors. Once inside, I locked the doors and started the engine, feeling a surge of relief as the car moved down the dirt road. I did not look back, even when the road wound through dense forest and I thought I might see someone in the shadows. I drove straight to the nearest town, stopping only when I felt safe among people again. The experience stayed with me for a long time. I could not shake the feeling that someone had been watching me, pacing around the cabin, waiting. I went back to the cabin weeks later during daylight with friends and inspected the area more carefully. The footprints were still there, but I never saw any signs of a person hiding or camping nearby. It was clear that someone had been stalking the cabin, but why and how long I would never know. Eventually, I stopped going to that cabin. I realized that my desire for solitude had blinded me to the risks of isolation in the wilderness. I invested in security cameras and started hiking only on well-traveled trails. The experience had terrified me, but it also taught me the importance of preparation, awareness, and caution. I never returned to that forest alone, but I could not deny the strange, lasting sense of vigilance it left me with. Even now, years later, when I am in a quiet place, I sometimes imagine footsteps behind me, and I remember the heavy, silent fear of being watched, completely alone with no one to help. Looking back, I understand that the forest had been beautiful, but it had also been dangerous. The cabin had seemed safe and isolated, but it had become a trap because of my lack of awareness. The clear lesson I took away was simple. Nature is unpredictable, and solitude can be dangerous when there are other people who do not respect boundaries. I survived because I stayed calm, stayed alert, and acted cautiously. The fear I felt was real, but it did not break me. In the end, I left that place intact, learned my lesson, and carried it with me for life.